listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning emperor in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. First of all, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all having a great morning. It is July 30th, just after 7 a.m. Eastern. It's a Friday. Hope everybody has a great weekend. But I'll say that again in about 3 hours. First up, we'll get a show. And in COVID news, there are about 95,083 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. That leaves us with about 389 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 71,621 cases per day. That's an increase of 151%. From the average 2 weeks ago. 49% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 57% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 34,861,000 people total across the United States, and it's killed over 612,000 of us. This also comes as today the United States has the highest number of new cases in the world. Compared to other countries, we are back at that point. If you look at a chart, particularly of the cases, we are about where we were in like late October last year, going into the, winter cold and flu season, winter cold and flu and COVID season. That was the sharpest peak by far we've seen. We're in the mode leading up to that right now. If you look at the number of new cases on a chart, so definitely worrying. But I don't know what we're doing about it. In national news, ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick has been criminally charged with sexual assault after the Catholic Church found him guilty of molesting a child at a wedding reception. McCarrick is the first cardinal in the U.S. to be criminally charged, as all other issues have been dealt with by the church. McCarrick faces 3 counts of indecent assault and battery with a person over 14. Washington, D.C. has reinstated the mask mandate for both vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. This also comes as Pelosi gave instructions to Capitol Police to arrest anyone who does not comply with the mandate on the Capitol grounds. That's the way to deal with the peasants, I guess. Or it's just extremely strict enforcement of a policy that you deem necessary to public health. I'll leave that to the audience to determine for themselves. This is going to be applicable starting Saturday, according to D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. D.C. is just the latest area to reinstate the mandate, following Nevada, Los Angeles, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Cape Cod, St. Louis, and Kansas City. And so now, by the way, Jamarl, that means D.C., Kansas City, both cities with mask mandates back in place, and also both cities where we're broadcasting. It's just, a coincidence, I suppose.
Is it a coincidence?
Or there's a correlation there.
There's a correlation there. There's a deep correlation.
There's a deeper correlation. I hear you. In international news, the economies of Germany and France are growing again in the second quarter of this year, although their economies haven't grown enough to reach pre-pandemic levels. That's in contrast to the United States. They seem to have slightly tighter purse strings, however, or at least the money that they spend. I don't know. You can make the case that the United States has spent a lot of money, like a lot of money, and that some of that has just been wasteful, or like, going to elites who don't necessarily need it. But it's like, hey, we're printing out money. Let's give some to the people who already have some. That'll make them more happy, right? Anyway, I don't know how much that's happened here compared to there. I get the feeling a bit more, but something to talk about later. South Korea's central bank says North Korea's economy has undergone its steepest losses in more than 20 years, a 4.5% contraction due to the effects of the pandemic and ongoing sanctions. Now, this is all speculation because Pyongyang does not release its numbers. Again, this is speculation from the South Korean central bank. 4.5% contraction, big, but that's not like 20 or 30 or something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm associating GDP contraction with the stock market contraction, because I've seen, the stock market drops 20, 30 radically percent sometimes.
The GDP drop is massive. But 4.5% is huge.
But 4.5%, exactly. That's pretty big compared to that. Those are two different numbers.
We're talking about specifically, like, we often say that the stock market is not the economy. Oh, totally. Obviously, right? 100%. And in this very specific case, we're talking about basically everything that a nation is, the productivity of a nation. And it's like, what does it look like for 4.5% drop when you're talking about the totality of a nation? Yeah, those numbers get big after a while.
Yeah, absolutely. The first person to be convicted under Hong Kong's new security law has been sentenced to 9 years in jail having been found guilty of trying to support secession and engage in terrorist activities. We've been talking about this case over the last couple of days. In fact, this was the man that Michael was calling about yesterday, talking about the headline of ours, where, he was being tried under the secession law that's like a colonial law, simultaneously also being tried under terrorism charges for driving a motorbike into cops and stuff. Anyway, more than 100,000 children.
Real quick, by the way, that would get you 9 years here too.
Yes. More than 100,000 children could be facing life-threatening malnutrition in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray, a tenfold jump over previous years. It has been 2 weeks since the World Food Program was able to enter the Tigray region, and humanitarian experts say that within 12 months, we could see massive deaths from malnutrition. But even if you don't see a bunch of deaths, what you do see are just drastically lowered quality of life among the people who suffer malnutrition, like that permanently slowed brain development and body development and etc. President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has restored the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States. That agreement allows the U.S. to rotate troops through the country as they engage in war drills and military exercises. President Duterte had previously planned to withdraw from the deal and engage more closely with China on the Chinese side, but he is siding again with the U.S., at least in this case. President Biden said the first flight of Afghan interpreters who worked with the United States has landed in the U.S., something we were, wondering about back about a month plus ago, how those interpreters would be handled specifically. But, more broadly, any Afghanis who are officially working with the invading U.S. forces, a big question.
Yeah.
And that's specifically with interpreters. That has been our policy. In Olympic news, so far the medal leaders in order are the United States, China, Russian athletes, Japan, and Australia. As of this morning, China has the most gold medals with 18. They're taking that place from Japan, which had that seat yesterday. Japan's following currently at 16 gold medals, and the U.S. currently has 14. And I'm going to call it there. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Big news in some sense today, I think. A couple of things. So for, Cardinal being charged with molestation, the first Cardinal in the U.S. to be criminally charged. That's a big deal on that front. I would say, though, the COVID cases, the fact that the U.S. is again at the head of the pack and that we're seeing consistently rising case counts. We've had a more than doubling of new cases.
Yeah.
Like every day for a week plus at this point, a couple weeks it feels like. I'd have to go back and actually check. But if that keeps continuing, that's exponential, to be clear. That doubling is a doubling of the doubling of the doubling at a certain point. You know what I mean?
Well, I think this is why Biden has gotten that aggressive. I'm not sure if you read this as a headline, but it's massive news as the repercussions are going to be significant. The Biden administration changing its guidance, basically mandating federal workers to get vaccinated.
Yes.
On top of Biden doing this, I don't know why I keep doing that. On top of Biden doing this, you have Apple, Google, you have hospitals all across the United States, meaning private enterprises also now saying, yeah, maybe we should get people vaccinated before coming back to work.
Yeah.
And so, initially beforehand, it looked like, all right, we'll give you a choice. We'll give you an option. Shane, I'm going to give you it's your right to get a vaccination or not. And then after a while, it's like, all right, Shane, you didn't make the right choice. So now we need to force you to get the vaccination. It's that stuff, right? We want you to make the right choice. All right, you didn't make the right choice, so now we need to push you the right choice. It's that stuff. It's like the governors, like when they're like, we just assume that people would do the right thing. It's like, why? Why do you assume that? Why do you assume that? I don't know why people assume that. In this very specific case, though, Biden has gotten basically saying federal workers are going to get vaccinations or face restrictions. Now, that was the part I thought wasn't, because my first thought
regularly tested.
Regularly tested. I was like, you can't. I was like, can you really force people to get a vaccine? I was like, that seems dodgy. But then that's where the other part comes in. It's not really forcing. We're just going to need you to get tested every day, 3 times a day. And it's like, what? That's basically forcing me. No, you have the option. You can get, and it's not 3 times a day for 5 times a day. I think it's like 2 or 3 times out of the week. But you understand why he's doing this. This is what my monologue is going to be on. I have great qualms with this. By the same token, it's like, this is the worst. This is horrible with the exception of every other option. It feels that way.
It's interesting. I don't care about it particularly because people can just get tested. They don't have, testing actually seems to, okay, so what else do you do?
Yeah.
Just testing people. It seems like about the least invasive thing. And then what happens if they happen to test positive, even if it's a false positive, on the off chance that it's a false positive? It's not like they're then
quarantine.
They put them in a straitjacket, you tie them to a gurney, you wheel them into the other room, and then you rip their shirt off and stab a jab into their arm. That's not what happens. They just go home. It's not like the In other words, there's this completely safe and relatively convenient track that people can follow where they're getting tested a couple of times a week to see if they're able to spread it. That seems like a pretty bare minimum thing. I don't see that as Biden forcing people to get vaccinated. Sure, there's technically an incentive there. No.
Going so far as to say federal workers basically saying, all right, federal workers are going to have to get vaccinated.
Either get vaccinated or you get tested.
Get multiple testing over the course of the week and several.
Yeah, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I know you're thinking that this is going to be hyperbolic. This is a big deal. This is Biden forcing on some level. Whatever you want to think about it.
As a big deal. I'm not saying that there's no reason for people to freak out about it. I guess I'm a weird guy because yesterday I was saying the entire government's policy has been and would inevitably be flawed, and like this whole thing is a terrible. And now I'm on the other side.
That's kind of like anywhere you go is where you're at. There is no such thing as perfect policy, like talking about. So I don't have the expectation of perfection. What I do have an expectation of is this kind of, all right, what are the positives? What are the negatives? What's the worst case scenario, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I look at this, I'm okay with this. I all things being equal, I am very dodgy about this. And maybe this is why my reaction to this is
you just said you were okay with it. Which is it?
Both.
Okay.
Both. People are complicated. It's the same thing with the, I don't know how many people have this is my perfect perspective of this.
Yeah.
No, I have great qualms with the government trying to force people to do things or companies trying to force people to do things.
Hang on a second. What if the vaccine wasn't involved at all and everybody just had to get tested a couple times a week? Would that be at all?
I don't think that would be horrific to try to get people back to work.
Any better or worse?
As opposed to just, all right, we need people to get tested X amount over the course of the week, et cetera.
Here's another way of looking at this. If you don't want to get tested, you can get the vaccine, but no pressure. Or you can just keep getting tested. No pressure.
See, but there is pressure. There is pressure.
Well, where's the official pressure?
The official pressure is Biden coming out making the speech saying we need people to get vaccinated. The official pressure is the change in policy, whereas beforehand, hey, just try to get vaccinated to, okay, federal workers need to get vaccinated, or you could have this kind of inconvenience of having to get tested 2 times a week, which is, again, is his push of trying to say, just get vaccinated, just get vaccinated. Look, I guess I have 2 responses. My first response is, I don't like mandates. I hate this notion of forcing people to inject something in their body as a mandate.
Defended mask mandates.
Well, I said injecting things in their body.
Okay, it's the vaccine one.
Yeah, it's how much of a pain is this mandate? It's that part. And if it gets to this notion of, wait a minute, I have to put something in my body, I have to put something on me, I have to do, that gets very dicey to me. And I get problematic with it. But the other side of that is, okay, what's the alternative? And it's like, well, the alternative is he doesn't do that. Well, that alternative played out over the course of the last 6 months. And look, there's all sorts of things. He's also pushing to try to get people $100. Meaning trying to get the states to say, look, give people $100 if they get vaccinated. That is mind-blowing to me. Is there any difference between that and get the pickup truck and everything else? I don't think so.
No, except that it's cheaper.
Yeah, right. It's cheaper than the pickup truck. Well, or is it? I mean, he's talking about $100 everybody to get vaccinated.
I'm making a joke.
Yeah. But no, my qualms with this are straightforward. I'm complicated. People are. It's this thing of, I don't like the government mandating this stuff. I don't want this stuff mandated if I worked somewhere where they were like, you're forced to get this. By the same token, 600,000 people have dropped dead. 30 million people have been infected. And at this point, the United States is the highest again around the world in regards to infections. What do? It's like your first strategy of, okay, we're going to trust people to do the right thing. And we're going to just give them this encouragement. And we're going to make this stuff available to them, et cetera. Okay, that didn't work.
Yeah.
And then you could even say, well, look, dude, you guys could have went further with that. Maybe you should have allowed people to have time off work when they get the vaccinations. Maybe that's one thing right off the bat. Maybe the $100 right off the bat, maybe that's not a bad thing. I would have liked the $100 for getting my vaccine. I was dodgy about it. I ended up getting it. I'm not going to get my $100. I'm very bothered by that. What about me, Joe Biden? But you get my point. There's something dramatic about a government, a private enterprise telling you to put something in your body. Now, from the standpoint of Google, Facebook, tech companies, and I know the administration is working with these companies all across the United States because in their heads at this point, we need to get those numbers up. How do we get those numbers up? Let's talk to the companies. Let's push this from the federal government. Maybe if we do this from the federal government standpoint, the other companies will fall into line. Those companies want those workers back. Those companies do not want those workers taking a week off or 2 weeks off if they get COVID and stuff like that. They don't want that. So from the standpoint of vaccinations, it does make sense if they would incentivize or push, et cetera. And even from Biden's standpoint, it does make sense. His presidency on some level the success of it is going to be dependent upon whether or not he succeeds with this. So I'm not shocked by that. I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong on that. Biden's presidency, like everything else, every other priority that Biden wants to get accomplished, the infrastructure bill and all that other stuff is secondary to COVID. Tell me if I'm wrong.
I'm thinking about it. I'm genuinely thinking about it. I mean, here's the thing. Who's going to be pushing him on that? Are Republicans? Is the Republican base? Is Trump? Trump might be, but is that message going to resonate at all with Republicans?
Even if a lot of people die from COVID, like let's say these numbers go to 5,000 again.
This is okay. Well, but that's a separate topic.
Or is it?
We're talking about maybe, but we're talking about the vaccination. You can still have technically a lot of breakthrough cases and a lot of a relatively low vaccination rate where there's still enough protection that the deaths don't get back up to 5,000. They get up to 1,500 or 2,000.
Let's say 2,000,
something like that. I don't know. But that's also separate from the vaccination rate, which was the specific sort of atomic thing that we were talking about here. I don't know how it would go. But with that specifically, my point is I don't see the Republican base hitting Biden on that.
On vaccination rates?
On the vaccination rate.
Fox News.
They don't want vaccines.
Fox News is going to turn on a dime and said, look at all of these people. Because even though they may not hit them on the vaccination rates.
But is that going to resonate? Is that going to? They're going to hit them because technically it's a case of hypocrisy and failure. But is there a Republican base? Are you going to see Republican mobs? You failed to get us vaccinated. No,
I think they're going to say you failed on COVID.
Oh, well, sure.
And they're going to say you hit Trump on this. You failed on COVID. They're not going to deal with the constituent elements of why he failed and that failure having to do with the safe space. None of that stuff's going to apply.
Yeah. But I hear you. I get your point generally.
You have a lot of people who are, let's say, the broad distribution of the country, not right-wingers, not Republicans, just broad distribution of the country. Do they expect Joe Biden to keep them safe from COVID? Meaning, do they expect the numbers to go to 2,000 again? And if the numbers went to 2,000 again, are they going to point the finger at Biden on something that he failed on? Now, we pointed the finger at Biden and said, dude, you failed on this. I do believe that they would look at him and say, this is your primary mission.
I get it. I was responding originally to the vaccine thing. If that happens, yes, but Biden will fail on the vaccine thing. I'm just going to say that right now.
Shane Stranahan is going on the record.
Well, but I've already said it, pretty much. Biden will fail on it. There's no way the government can get this to work at this point. Too many bridges have been burned. It's not last year that the government should have started to try to mend the wounds that it's dealt to the public or whatever. It's like many years ago. Now, theoretically, there were windows of opportunity last year where this stuff could have handled, major forks in the road. But at this point, what can he do? The messaging is so terrible. People distrust Biden and the administration so much. The people that he wants to get vaccinated particularly, he can't convince them. And if he can't convince them, and you're right about that being the last chance for his presidency, well, then his presidency's done, isn't it?
Look, I don't take it as he has no chance of doing it. I don't have a crystal ball where I can make that. Sometimes I would do that. This kind of like, I will stand on this mountain and I would say that such. This is not one of those cases because it does seem like all sorts of private enterprise and corporations and everything else are backing him. And if you get this kind of large web across the country of these companies saying, you want to keep your job? You want to keep your job, buddy? Get the vaccine. I mean, we had to get vaccinated to come back to work, for God's sake. And so if these larger companies, everything else are pushing it, no, I don't think Biden in and of himself, by himself, can do it. Do I think that corporate America getting involved and saying, all right, we don't want these deaths up. We want to make sure these people can go back to work. We're getting pressure from the White House, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would that goose the numbers? Yes. Goose them to what? I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know if that's 10%. I don't know if that's 15%. And either way, is it enough?
And
I don't know.
Is it enough with boosters on the way?
Yeah,
and
right.
The need to prepare for new variants?
And that's just, I don't know.
That's where it is, in my opinion, very clearly not enough.
That's where it gets treacherous. The transmissibility of the Delta variant may be higher, or it seems to be higher. And it seems to be higher in a way that it is breakthrough in regards to some of the vaccines. Like you said, the boosters and all this other stuff that seems to be necessary to be part of the mix. Yeah, they're going to be bringing all of this stuff up. They need to be bringing out vitamin D. They need to be bringing out any and everything that could potentially have some legitimate scientific thing of lowering these numbers or lowering the transmissibility of this particular virus. And it shouldn't just be the vaccines. Like, I am very clear in this camp of if vitamin D is showing a positive benefit in the way that people can accommodate the virus, or whether they get caught or at all, meaning lowering how people deal with it, then you should do that. It just seems common sense.
I brought up, okay, so
I don't know if people bring up ivermectin. I don't know enough about ivermectin.
I get that. The jury's not out on that one completely. So it's not like some people are like, this is the miracle cure, but it's like, okay, there are only a couple of studies yet, and they are promising. But
that's my point. It's everything, early. All due diligence.
But if you're going to do something, it's going to be like, get in shape, lose as much weight as is, healthy for you, get down to a healthy weight, start exercising, that kind of thing. That is going to help you weather the storm so much more. I mean, granted, a drug, I'm not saying
smoking, stress,
those kinds of things. Yeah. Yes.
All that stuff applies. But look, I don't entirely disagree with you. And maybe, I don't entirely disagree with you. It's just, I don't know if things change. I don't know if public perception shifts. I don't have a crystal ball for that stuff. And because the stuff is in this kind of weird spot where there is public pressure, like right here, vaccine mandates are popular. Support for different types of vaccine mandates show little change in recent months. Require everyone to get the COVID vaccine shot. 64% in June and July, 62% in April. That's terrifying to me for some reason. I grant and I get, and maybe this is my own libertarian streak going through where I'm like, I don't want you to force me to get a shot or whatever else. Even though by simultaneously, I'm like, yeah, this is problematic. I mean, that's where I fall. I flicker back and forth on us. It's like my own way of arranging the world in that sense versus, all right, the pragmatic, this is the reality to which we're dealing with. Look, Shane, I don't know. If it gets anything out of it.
Here's the other thing, man. If it's not just, okay, let's raise the vaccination rate, let's make the population more immune, but let's cut the spread of this thing out completely. If that's the gold standard here, we're never going to do that anywhere even close to that in the slightest bit, because guess what? When we were talking herd immunity, the lowest estimates were like in the 60%, that 60% of the population needs to be vaccinated. That's absolute lowest. It started to get 70. Really, it's like mid-80s that they were like, okay, this is real good. You're real good herd immunity right here. But with the new variants and with increased transmissibility and a vaccine, any given vaccine being more and less effective against any number of variants that are going to come running over you in unpredictable waves, that number goes up significantly. Where I've said this before on the air, but I was looking at a study, and some of the more conservative estimates were, or the more like aggressive estimates were 98%. 98% of the population needing to be vaccinated, which is not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Under
nowhere
the best
close.
Case scenario,
under the best case scenario,
never going to happen.
You could implement nationwide, and every state could have vaccine mandates, and there would still be like a recalcitrant 5%. God bless them. Who's like, nope,
not doing it.
Sorry, not doing that.
Don't need the job. Don't need the X. Don't need the Y.
And what do you do with that population?
Yeah. I mean, are you putting those people in prison?
No, horrible. Don't do that. Don't do no.
That's what I mean when I said the mandate thing. It's problematic. I mean, you are creating all sorts of. The fact that he has to do this is an indication of failure, right? It's an indication that something is going monstrously wrong, that the perception of we're going to just walk this, people are going to do it, we're going to walk our way through, we're going to do infrastructure, we're going to do this, that type of stuff. He was there. I can't think of the name of the guy, the governor that did that. But the fact that the CDC has come on change its guidance, that's not positive. The CDC isn't doing it because it wants to. The CDC is doing it because it had to on some level. Joe Biden coming out and changing protocols, doing this is not going to be popular, meaning it's popular, but it's not something that he wanted to do.
And guess what? Remember, it was just about a month and a half ago. We were all looking forward to the 4th of July.
Yeah, it was like, we're going to be with no masks.
Biden's like, you guys can have a backyard barbecue. Yeah, it's the 4th. I'll let you. Here, take your permission slip.
See, that was the politics. He's trying to, I think,
get people excited because of vaccination, and get the vaccination in your arm and get out in the streets and have a great time. But no, that doesn't work.
It didn't work.
It did not work.
It did not work. Decidedly did not work. And so now, heavy-handed Joe Biden. Okay, I need these companies to start forcing vaccines. I need these, because at that point, that's forcing, by the way. Meaning, when your wages are on the line, am I going to be able to eat next week? Otherwise, I need to get that type of stuff. Yeah, man, it's awkward. Yeah. It's unfortunate.
No, but here's the other thing, man. Because this is, I've heard this other take, which is, hasn't the U.S. required vaccinations in the past? Hasn't this been a thing before with other serious diseases that we've had to deal with? So like, it's
like
just
for schools.
Are we just entitled at this point, or is the libertarian streak valid? Do we have less reason to trust the current government than we did 80, 100 years ago? That kind of thing.
But I'll say this: I didn't like the fact that they would mandate that stuff prior. Like, I mean, do you really want a company or a government saying you must get this injected into your body?
I don't know, but I'll put it like this. My great-grandmother, who I never met, had polio. She stood like 4'7", 4'8", something like that. It's the last, I never met her. None of my other family members had polio. Mm-hmm. It was a problem that even though she lived a long life, lived past the age of 100, it was still like, slowed her down, made her life worse. I don't know people with polio. It's gone. Yes. So it's like, that's a distant blip in the memory. So therefore, if that kind of thing could happen with COVID, it made itself into one of those sort of perpetual boogeymen, like something like polio, where it's this disease that you hear that we've moved past. It's like we killed the zombie or whatever.
Like chickenpox.
COVID's not necessarily in that category yet, but if it were, wouldn't we want it gone?
Oh, look, 1,000%. You're not getting a disagreement with me on whether or not they want the virus gone. Of course I want the virus gone. The catch is, how do we do it? Is it, do we need to go to that degree of, we're going to force human beings to sit in the chair and inject something into their bodies that, look, what the callers call in all the time and say it's not necessarily even FDA approved.
It's because it's not. It's emergency use authorized.
Emergency use drug.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
it will be FDA approved in September, and so that argument is basically going to go away. But you're still going to get to the same argument of, do you want to be forcibly done? No, I don't want to be forcibly done. Do I want to be convinced? Yes. And is there a situation where there's a middle ground? I don't know. But do I hate this? No. If I had to come down on one side where it says, all right, 3 a.m., you and your God, what's your choice? I would say, okay, fair enough. This is what's necessary. Because again, I've never had that perspective that people just do what the right thing.
I don't have that perspective either. I don't have that perspective either. People aren't naturally good, but I feel like there's something dynamic about civilization or society that over time people tend to, through communication, work out better solutions for things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like how we adapt. And I'm not saying that, there's nothing magical about it. My point is we can learn.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, if we had a healthier society where we were sort of mutually educating each other and our science establishment were clearly separated from our political establishment, but both of them were useful.
Yeah.
If the science establishment were doing the best knowledge creation and verification, and the political establishment were doing solid leadership, explanation, good governance, solving our problems, those are all things they're supposed to do. And then they, in their respective roles, work together to sort of counsel us in a crisis. That would be cool.
It would be cool. Unfortunately, that's not our world. What you end up having is just messiness.
Yeah.
Like you have a competitive system. It's competition. And if I can take advantage of you, doesn't matter how, doesn't matter if people are dying in the process, then I have an incentive to do it. And you're not going to get everybody. Some people are just like, oh God, that's horrible, even on that same side. Not everybody's like that though. I mean, so it's unfortunate. I want to get to also, and we're going to have a conversation about this going forward, the Simone Biles case. I was reading more into this last night, and I was shocked by this. Did you know that they were gutting her score? They were taking points away from her because she was so good, to get it across. She was so good that the things and the exercises, the routines that she was doing wasn't stuff that the other gymnasts could do. And so because it wasn't stuff that the other gymnasts could do, the scoring for it should have been higher than what it was. But they would undercut her score over and over again in order to just kind of make it like we're going to try to balance this stuff out.
Well, you just made me instantly on her side. Now I'm on her side.
When I read that, I thought, you should have stopped right there.
Yeah.
You should have said, I'm done right there.
Screw them. You're the best they have, and then they're rejecting you because they can't understand you.
Think about that. Them changing all right, we need to change the goalpost for Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
We need to make the thing different because of Jordan. We need to change it for Tiger Woods.
Cordell, if you hear us getting something wrong here, or if you disagree, please correct us. Because, you might know more about this stuff, of course. You would.
Yeah.
So
I was just shocked by it. But yeah, the routines.
But that sounds insane. That sounds horrible.
There were some of the routines that no women could do.
Yeah.
Like where it's or routines that were, let's say, on one event or one, let's say, staple, that you would turn it onto something else that would increase the difficulty of it. So instead of doing a typical routine, let's say one station, let's say you take it on the balance beam, which is 4 inches, and then you do the routine again. And it's like, whoa, is that safe? Should people be doing that? There was even a thought that the judges were gutting her score because they were trying to disincentivize people from trying it.
Really?
Yeah, that was even in the article.
God.
And I thought to myself, I was like, but that's sports, right? I mean, isn't it this thing where you get a Michael Jordan, you get a LeBron James, you get a Kobe Bryant, you get a Tiger Woods, you get a, what is her name? Serena Williams and her sister. And you get somebody else in the event that are shocked by how good this person is. It's like this physical specimen is just not something we thought it could be. But what happens? The sport evolves. The sport and people around it grow, develop, they get stronger, and they get to the point of being able to, on some level, compete, even if they can never be that godlike thing that Michael Jordan was, or Garry Kasparov was. I know Garry Kasparov has certain issues politically, but Garry Kasparov was a type of chess player that I had never seen and didn't think could exist.
Interesting.
That's how good he was. And so you're going to get sports, and you're going to get the creation of people like that in those sports. You can't ding him for being great.
For pushing the edges. It's like, the first person with the 4-minute mile, you're cheating.
Yeah, you're cheating.
That's dangerous.
Yeah. I was astonished. I just read through this, and I was like, I can't believe they're gutting her. And look, this is me, right? I could be a braggart. And so the idea that I would do something exceptional, and they're like, all right, we're going to give you less points on it.
Yeah.
I just did something exceptional.
That brings out like the really like cocky individualist in me. Like, you can't take any of this away.
You can't take that away from me.
It's not about me. It's not selfish. It's like, you can't shut down that spirit right there. And it's true. There's a Kurt Vonnegut. Actually, I haven't read it, but I've heard summaries of it. Harrison Bergeron, this short story by Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
You know, well-known mid-20th century author. It's about the society where basically anybody who excels in some way, if you're a beautiful singer, if you're incredibly handsome, you're extra tall, you're very good at sports, whatever, or you're, you know, a wonderful gymnast, say.
Yeah. Whatever it is.
It's intimidating to the public, and so they put handicaps on you to keep you from doing that thing. They want to dull people down to an average. And of course, it's hyperbolic and it's a sort of allegorical thing.
Yeah.
But that idea, just restricting people because you can't handle it, or because you can't understand it, or because you don't want other people who can't do it to try it and to fail or whatever. It's just horrible. You know what I mean? We got to go into our break. We're going to be coming back on this topic, getting into it, talking more about Simone Biles and the United States success, despite Biles dropping out in the all-around women's gymnastics yesterday. We will be back in a minute with our next guest, Emily Giambalvo, sports writer for the Washington Post. We'll be back with her in just a minute. Be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Emily Giambalvo. She's a sports writer for the Washington Post covering University of Maryland sports, and she's currently in Tokyo covering gymnastics for the Olympics. Gymnastics has been probably the biggest part of the Olympics so far, from the American perspective at least, with Simone Biles dropping out. Major star. Emily, I don't know if you heard what Jamarl and I were just talking about here, but we're talking about the reason why Biles dropped out. Is it true that basically she was doing a routine? She was doing the best routine they wanted her to do. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but she was basically doing it on a 4-inch wide platform. She was, in other words, she was sort of upping the ante. She was doing their best routine in an even harder way, and they dinged her for that. They gave her a lower score, even though that should, be off the charts. That should be better than the best. And then that was part of it. What's the truth here, Emily? That sounds ridiculous.
Okay, yeah, no, that's kind of not exactly what's going on here. I heard what you guys were talking about, and there is some conversation. It's very nuanced and a lot more complicated than what you just see in a headline about that maybe some of Simone Biles' skills could be a couple tenths higher in difficulty score. There's no deduction that's being taken because she's too good or anything like that. There's just kind of this really nuanced conversation about when new skills get created, they get awarded a difficulty value, and deciding kind of what that should be is always a complicated decision. And that's when you hear some of those conversations about, well, maybe this brand new vault she's doing should be worth a 6.8 instead of a 6.6. It's kind of that small of a difference, but that does come up. So that is one piece of the Simone Biles story. But the piece that is in the news right now about her deciding to withdraw from the Olympics is a totally different story. And basically what happened was she was competing a vault, and it was not her brand new vault that's in the news sometimes for this conversation about what it should be valued. She was doing actually one of her easier vaults, one she's done for years and is very good at. And when she was in the air, she just got totally lost and kind of almost lost her spatial awareness. And that's a very normal thing that happens to gymnasts sometimes. And I think the way she explained it was she really wasn't in the right mental headspace coming into the competition, and has been dealing with just some mental health challenges and wanted to prioritize that. And the way that manifested in her gymnastics was this really dangerous phenomenon where she lost her spatial awareness in the middle of a skill. And that's why she got the low score, was because she kind of bailed out of the skill midway through and had a really poor landing. And then she decided, hey, it's not safe for me to finish this competition. It's not safe for me to do the all-around competition 2 days later. And that's where we are right now, not knowing if she will compete again in Tokyo.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, those were two separate conversations. We weren't having them.
Jamarl explained it to me, and I think I lumped the two together and got slightly confused.
Yeah, no worries. But I did, from my standpoint, if I would have thought they were digging my score, I would have taken great issue with that. And I get your point. The distinction between, look, what she's doing, this routine is astonishingly hard. And it's like, what should be the score associated with that particular routine? I was just fascinated by that particular conversation in regards to how good she is. And on one point, just on spatial awareness, by spatial awareness, you mean the person's, explain what you mean by that, just so we can be specific.
Yeah, so basically when you are a gymnast, and I did gymnastics my entire life, and you are flying through the air and flipping and twisting, you have this like kind of uncanny ability to just know where you are and how to land and when to stop. And there are all these things that go into it that make gymnasts great. And it makes it so impressive that your body just like learns these skills and it becomes kind of muscle memory. And it's this really powerful thing that it ensures that you land safely as many times as possible.
But the problem is, if that's not there.
The problem is that wasn't there. Yeah. Yes.
And when that faculty is not there,
that's what we saw the other day.
This person is in the air, they're tumbling, they're twisting, twirling, and they need to be able to land. And if they don't think that they can credibly land, or they don't necessarily feel that their skills are intact, well, at this point, we're talking about a potential injury. And I think that's where the end-all be-all of this came in, where I wasn't in the right headspace, and I didn't necessarily want to break my back trying to do one of my routines. What was the talk? What was the consensus on that? I'm very curious, because sports is a different animal. Like, when I heard that, I had mixed feelings. Part of me thought, okay, I totally understand it. You don't necessarily want to get injured. You don't want to get ill or get hurt by doing a routine. By the same token, I also thought, you're an athlete. This is kind of part of the course. And if an athlete pushes through stuff like that, that person typically gets applauded for being able to push through. I'm thinking of Michael Jordan falling in Scottie Pippen's arms after the final. How was this taken, let's say, in the Olympic village of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's been compared a lot to like the yips in other sports. The difference is in gymnastics, it's not like missing a free throw or missing a field goal or whatever it may be. It's a matter of landing on your head and landing on your feet. And that's what makes this so extreme in gymnastics, is because, it's so easy, or, I don't know, I can never unsee gymnastics from a perspective of someone who's done it. But sometimes I think people who aren't super closely tied to sports see it, and kind of the magic of Simone Biles is that she makes it look so easy. So you can almost forget like just how hard this is, just how dangerous this is. And when she wasn't in that frame of mind, it wasn't a matter of pushing through it, because it wasn't just like some, pain in her ankle or something like that. It was a matter of, am I going to land on my head possibly? And the way she described it was like, she made this decision for her safety, first and foremost. But secondly, she was like, if I go out there and am landing on my back on a skill instead of on my feet, the U.S. might not medal. Like, she saw that as a decision that was also considering the team's medal chances. And she knew that there were 3 other gymnasts on the team who could compete each event. And, in that kind of risk reward calculation, thought, you know what, I think those 3 gymnasts have a better chance of medaling as a team than she would with them if she was kind of in such a poor frame of mind.
That is a very good point. As Jamarl is whispering off mic, he's been repeating that. It is a very good point, because we're kind of on the line on this one in some of these ways. With that taken into account, we're having this conversation about how much this affects her ultimate reputation, because she is known, even quite young, 24, I believe, already known, one of the best gymnasts of all time, maybe the best gymnast of all time. That's the sort of like glowing language that used to describe her. Is this going to affect that reputation at all, Emily?
I don't think so. I think she was already considered the greatest gymnast of all time in Rio. I think she could have done nothing else and been considered that. The skills she's doing, like we're talking about, are harder than the skills anyone's ever done. I think, if anything, this just speaks to her maturity and awareness that this was something that could go wrong. Like, I don't think it makes her a better gymnast had she tried to compete and gotten hurt, right? Like, that just makes you a gymnast who maybe didn't make a smart choice that day. I think what she did was the smart choice. And I think it, shows that she's aware of her body and knows what she can and can't do. And now I think she's realizing, or has already known, how powerful her voice is, and that she can maybe even make a difference to show other gymnasts and other athletes, like, it's okay to prioritize your mental health. And if that mental health is getting in the way of you doing your sport safely, then a medal isn't more important than that.
If the mental health gets in, oh man, I'm so conflicted on that. And maybe I shouldn't be conflicted on that, but weirdly I am. It's not that I think that the person's mental health is of course, people should take care of their mental health. And of course, if you think you're going to get injured, don't do it. Meaning, if you're a NASCAR driver, you're not feeling it that morning because you feel like, my eyesight is a little weird, or, my balance is off. Don't force that. It's like, got to get out there and I got to get on the track. That would be insane, right? You're going to kill people or yourself. So I totally get that. I guess there's a gray area to me in regards to where the mental health come into play and where the mental health should dominate. Because I do think there's a difference between I'm not feeling it versus pushing through it, and where that line is. I mean, because there's no case where every scenario where a certain person says, I'm not feeling it today, I'm just going to blow it off. But that's going to fly. Or should it fly? And by the way, if she was being paid for this, that was the other part. What if this was a paid sport? Like she was getting millions of dollars to do X into Y, et cetera, et cetera. Then what? I mean, are we still as forgiving of the athlete for taking that mental health day under that guise? I mean, you tell me.
We should be.
You said we should be.
If we're not, then people need to think really hard about what they're prioritizing. I mean, I think. Well,
the Amazon worker. Let's talk about the Amazon worker, for example. That worker goes in, day out, doing something very heavy that is injuring and hurting themselves. They're doing it every day. They need a job. The football player. I used to have a doctor, and my doctor was telling me about the old football players whose bodies are just trashed at the end of a 20-year or how many ever year career, making millions of dollars, playing in pain over and over and over again. There's almost an expectation of it on some level, right? I mean, it's professional sports. Would there be a difference if she was being paid to the tunes of millions?
No, I don't think so, because she could have gotten so seriously hurt. And I think no matter what's on the table, whether that's a medal or money, that has to win out. And I think the other important distinction is that, like, she never once, used the phrase or said anything along the lines of, like, not feeling it today. It was all about, like, I understand how dangerous this sport is, and I understand the importance of being 100% on when you're doing these skills that are harder than anyone else in the world. And one thing that I think speaks so loudly to this is any person who I've seen talk about this who did gymnastics is like, oh my gosh, she made the right decision. Like, anyone who has felt that feeling of flying through the air and not knowing where you are and not knowing where you're going to land and just hoping for the best. And then you imagine that, but on competition surfaces, not going into a pit, for instance, and you imagine that doing the skills that are as hard as Simone is doing, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, there's no way. So everyone I know has kind of been in that boat of, like, good for her that she was able to make such a smart decision and the right decision for her, the right decision for the team, and that she was willing to give up a medal. I mean, this is not her, like, not being given something. Like, she could have won a medal the other day and said, I'm not risking it. And I think that's like, that tells you all you need to know, because there's no doubt in my mind that if Simone thought she could do this, she would have done it, because she's an athlete, she's a competitor, she's won so many things, she's done it over and over and over for years. And that just tells you how serious this was.
And on this, kind of my last thought on this, at least, the money thing that you brought up, Jamarl, where basically, if she were getting paid, would that change this? In the same way that she had the sense to drop out, thinking that the dropping out would be better for the team than staying in, you'd hope that her coach would have the same sense. You'd hope that the team, that's paying her whatever, that she's a part of, would realize, hey, better to put in an alternate, let her pull out whatever. That will be better if she's not feeling it. Yeah. Far better for her, certainly, but also probably better for the scores too. It's just a better situation all around. So I don't know how much the money actually necessarily would have to affect that. I don't know. I don't know genuinely. How much has Biles dropping out affected the U.S.'s success so far in gymnastics in the Olympics? Sunisa Lee won the women's all around, so that's a big deal, of course. But in the other categories, in the other competitions, How have we done? And how do you think we would have done if she were feeling her best and still in it, Emily?
Yeah. I mean, if Simone's at her best in the team competition, the U.S. is going to win. I mean, I don't think there's too much question about that. If she had been there, if she had competed at all 4 events and had been the Simone that we've watched for almost the last decade, then I think they win, no question. So I do think it was the difference between a gold and a silver. But again, it's like if she had tried to compete while in the state she was in, maybe we're talking the difference between a silver and 4th, like it goes the other way too.
1000%. It's the sliding door stuff. I totally get it.
Yeah,
it is crazy. Teams have like psychologists and stuff like that to work with the athletes as they, go about getting prepared for it, especially her. Considered the greatest of all times is pretty heady. And there's massive amounts of pressure. I was watching Insecure. It's a show that my wife have turned me on to that I basically have been watched like nobody's business. She's even mentioned in like this kind of weird comment of, hey, it's like, I'm going to be like Simone Biles, talking about how I'm going to be the greatest of all times or whatever they're talking about. Like that is pretty heady for a person and knowing they're going into the event like that. Do they have like team psychologists and things like that to try to get the person in the right headspace when they're going through the various events?
Yeah, and I know she has publicly talked about how she has seen a sports psychologist years ago, and that has been part of her training. And then I know the U.S. OPC said that they had resources here, whether that be professional, medical professionals and psychologists that were here to help her. I think the turnaround for the all-around final was just so quick that I don't know how you can make that leap in that short amount of time. But yeah, I mean, it is the emotional toll, and I've thought about this a lot lately, but in hindsight, you look at it, and I think we all kind of recognize this in the moment too, but here's this gymnast who is not only expected to excel at her sport, but is expected to be an advocate for sexual abuse survivors and an advocate for women and an advocate for Black athletes and social justice movements, and she's seen as someone who can go to these games and anything less than 5 gold medals is a disappointment. And you think about the toll of that and you're like, how would that not just break a person? So I think this whole experience has kind of been a reality check to just everyone to really take a step back and think about the pressure of these athletes, and particularly the pressure of these top athletes who maybe seem to be superhuman, especially in a sport like gymnastics where they're doing these absolutely crazy skills, but they are still dealing with this real mental load that just can become too much at times.
No, I know how you feel. I played chess for 20 years, and in those tournaments, rough, man, moving pawns and stuff. Very rough. It's rough. It's treacherous.
It's treacherous. Dangerous water.
Dangerous water. Right?
You spill a pawn and it bounces off the wall and hits your head. I don't know.
No, I'm totally teasing. And yes, you're absolutely right. Pressure is astonishing. World pressure. So yeah, I totally get it. The voice that you guys are listening to is Emily Giambalvo. She is a sports writer for the Washington Post, covering University of Maryland sports, and she's currently in Tokyo covering gymnastics for the Olympics. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to come back with her to continue the conversation. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been talking about the Olympics, specifically Simone Biles dropping out. We're going to move to other elements of the Olympics. Basically, what has the games been like and the impression so far on the ground? The guest that we have joining us, fortunate to be joining us, Emily Giambalvo. She is a sports writer for the Washington Post, covering the University of Maryland sports, and she's currently in Tokyo covering gymnastics for the Olympics. Again, Emily, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I really do appreciate this conversation on Simone Biles. I was reading through some of the stuff yesterday about how good she is and her difficulty. And oh man, I was enamored by this particular story. And even this kind of controversy and the back and forth on her pulling out and whether she should pull out and what, would that have been different under these various scenarios and how it's like all of the controversy and all of the conversation around it, I've just found to be fascinating. And, she's a person. She's at the center of all this stuff. There's some people who are very dark in regard to their temperament on this. And, it's just interesting that a person is going to have to deal with all of this stuff moving forward. I want to get into the Olympic Games itself, though. What is your perception or, the controversy, I suppose, is that the Olympics was not necessarily going to have spectators there, despite the fact that these are basically spectator sports. And so what has been your take on that? Has it gone off without a hitch? Have you seen the Olympics just the Olympics? Is it surreal, not having necessarily the public and the audience? Like, what has been your take on this COVID Olympics?
Yeah, it's been totally bizarre. And I think, a lot of people have asked me that. And I always say, like, just picture your favorite or go-to Olympic moment in your mind. The one that like comes to mind is this like just great athletic accomplishment. And then you try to imagine that inside a empty arena and it just doesn't feel right because there are these two conflicting things in your brain where you're like, this is such an important moment. And then like, why is the environment around it not matching that?
So the moment in my head is the Olympic gymnast, the one where the woman was injured. She runs down. I think she injures her ankle or something like that. She nails the jump despite being injured. And I remembered everybody goes bananas. Now, to your point, what does that look like in an empty auditorium?
Yeah, and it's so weird because you hear the voices on the floor, and it's almost like we've time traveled back to, like the heart of the college basketball season. I know like in the Big Ten when it was empty arenas and it was like the media there and the coaches and the players and that was it. And it was this like, it felt like some glorified practice and we were all, you could hear them in the huddle. You could hear all that. So it feels like we're back in that world, except it's not a regular season Big Ten game. It is the Olympics. So it's different. And when the other thing that's been at least kind of cool is that the members of the delegation. So like when the women's gymnastics team is competing, the men's gymnastics team and the coaches of that team and just other people who are staff members are still allowed to go. So it's like the only people in the stands are kind of like these little clusters of like the Brazil national team and the U.S. national team. And it's kind of cool to like see like that and just be able to like pick out all these people that they're not all just smushed together in a big crowd like they normally would be. They're like the only ones there. So it isn't completely silent. You at least have them. Like at the all-around final the other day, you had Simone Biles there, and you could hear her voice cheering, not just for the U.S. gymnasts, but for the other gymnasts from other countries. Because it was so quiet, you could actually make out, oh my gosh, that's Simone Biles' voice cheering while the Russian gymnast is doing her beam routine. But yeah, no, it's been weird. I think in general, though, the athletes are just so happy that there is an Olympics. A lot of these people have one shot to make it. And when it got postponed a year ago, I think it was this wake-up call that like, oh my gosh, this is not guaranteed. So I think they understand that they are just really glad that they're getting this chance to kind of go for these medals and live out this dream. But it does feel a lot different than I'm sure they imagined kind of all those years of leading up to this.
It almost sounds like it is more for them in a weird way. Like you said, a training session, if teams are watching each other perform and there's not that much press around and, you're in a foreign country, it sounds like it's a weird environment. But I guess my point is, it almost sounds like a cool environment for the athletes themselves, albeit not for the spectators who can't spectate, but for the athletes themselves, it sounds, I don't know, weirdly made for them.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. It's almost like poetic in a way that like at its core, these competitions are just these athletes competing in their sport. And of course, I kind of laugh even saying that though, because there's like this $1 billion industry of broadcasting these things and the rights and everything around that. And of course, these games are going on and that's all that money is still flowing in all the ways it normally does. But when you're inside the arena, it's like, okay, these are just some people competing in their sport and they're the best ones who can do it in the world. And it is kind of cool to see that. And I know talking to some of the gymnasts, they mentioned that it felt like like, I know the men's gymnasts were like, it just felt like it felt super chill. And I'm like, you would never hear someone describe an Olympic event as super chill, like in any other circumstance. But I think some of them, I think they'd all else equal would all prefer to have fans and friends and family here. But I think some of them kind of appreciate, like, yeah, it felt like kind of laid back, or maybe wasn't quite as nervous as you would have been otherwise.
Totally. 100% can see that. We've only got a couple minutes left with you, and it's great talking to you, not just because you clearly know what you're talking about, have done this for a long time, a personal experience, you're able to speak from that experience, but you're also there on the ground, of course. For you, if you we've only got a few minutes. I'm asking a question to try to get the audience kind of in your head a little bit, or in your looking out at the world from your eyes. What's it like being there? What's Tokyo like? How's the village setup seem? How is it with COVID, the state of emergency in the city there? It's a very weird environment. So we've talked about the athletes, but from your perspective, trying to situate people in the audience, what's it like for you, Emily?
Yeah, and I went to the Pyeongchang Olympics 3 years ago, and I actually said the same thing. When people would ask me how was South Korea, I would always kind of joke, I didn't go to South Korea, I went to the Olympics. And that's true even more so now. You don't really feel like you're just like in Tokyo or in a foreign city. You feel like you're just at the Olympics. And with media, we have a 14-day quarantine, which is not the best word for it, but basically it means you're not allowed to go anywhere apart from your hotel, the press center, and the venues. So I have not been anywhere in Japan. I have only been living my life in those 3 places. So it's been busy and fun, but you are very much kind of held in these areas because they don't want the virus to spread around the city. So it's been very regulated. We do testing. I've had probably about 10 COVID tests in the last 2 weeks, and it's all very controlled in that regard. So a lot of time just in those places, and they're keeping kind of a close eye on all of that.
I can imagine that they were going to be pretty stringent about that. They don't want to break through in the Olympic Village. That would be dramatically bad, to put it mildly. From your standpoint, did you compete in a previous Olympics? I know you said you did gymnastics in general.
No. I did level 10, which is like the highest level in the kind of like club system, but like the gap between that and like the Simone Biles of the world is absolutely massive. So it's like the gap between the average Joe on the sidewalk and a level 10 is probably pretty big too, but there's still one more huge leap. So yeah, no, never anything close to that level. Okay,
what does it mean to these athletes? I guess I was going to try to ask you, but what does it mean to these athletes to represent their country? I'm just very curious about that, because this is not, okay, here's $10 million, go do X. This is, okay, I've been training in the sport, I have excellence in the sport, and I'm going to represent my country. What does that mean? Like, what is the value of that? I guess I'm trying to nail that down, if it's even possible.
I think they just see it as like, you grow up seeing this as the pinnacle. Like, going to the Olympics means you are one of the best 5 athletes in gymnastics, or X number of athletes in track and field or swimming or whatever it is. You are one of the best, and like no one can ever question that. Nobody can ever take that away from you. It's kind of the ultimate like signature of like, I made it, like I did it in my sport. And in gymnastics specifically, like if you tell someone you were an Olympian, they're like, oh my gosh, like you're an Olympian. Whereas for me, when you asked me how good I was, I just had to like try to explain it in a way that nobody's even gonna understand, because I was just kind of a average Joe type person. But I think there's this huge pride in getting to this moment that they first grew up idolizing, and some point along the way realized was possible, and then had to perform under pressure in order to get there, and then are finally here and getting to experience it. I think it's just kind of like this ultimate dream, and for a lot of them, kind of the pinnacle of their careers.
And the last question here with you, Emily. What are you looking forward to in the next couple of days in terms of events? Through the rest of it, what are you going to be watching the most in gymnastics and outside of it? Just curious.
Yeah. So gymnastics has the apparatus finals left. I think the number one question everyone has is, will Simone Biles compete again? So I am going to be following that question very closely. I think Sunisa Lee's bar routine is absolutely the routine everyone should watch if they're picking one routine in gymnastics to watch. She is incredible and could win another gold medal on that event. I know I'm kind of excited to hopefully get to see some of these new sports like skateboarding and climbing. I just think that's like really unique and different. So I kind of want to see how those pan out. And then hopefully the end of the women's soccer tournament, I think, should be good too.
Cool. That makes perfect sense. Jamarl's sitting here going, climbing, but not chess. Come on, catch up. I'm not sure that's athletic enough. Emily Giambalvo, thank you so much for talking with us. Great conversation.
Yep. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And that was Emily Giambalvo. She's a sports writer for the Washington Post. She covers University of Maryland sports, and she's currently in Tokyo covering gymnastics for the Olympics. Great conversation. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last 2 hours of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly insist that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You guys are going to have to stay tuned for a fight that's going to take place a little bit later after headlines, where Shane is delved into the lion's den of chess not being athletic enough to being in a competition. He uttered the words on radio, and so the words, the resonance of it has to be challenged. Chess is competitive enough, athletic enough, body, engaging enough to be in the Olympics, blitz or otherwise. And we're going to have a conversation about it a little bit later, just out of personal pride. But let's get into the headlines. In the news, about 95,083 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 389 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 71,621 cases per day, an increase of 151% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this, 2 weeks earlier, 49% of the American public has been fully vaccinated. 57% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 34,861,501 unfortunate human beings across the United States and has killed an even more unfortunate 612,098 people. And then if you've noticed, we're going from 11,000, 12,000, 13,000, and it may be slow from the standpoint of, it takes a couple of days to hit that 1,000, but we are decidedly going up. And to make that much more clear, the United States has the highest number of new COVID cases in the world. We're back, baby! Number one. That is not the number one we want to be in. Hence, Joe Biden taking the measure of basically ordering that federal workers or people who are working for the federal government either get vaccinated or having just basically multiple tests over the course of the week to ensure that they are not infectious and potentially spreading it to the other people on the job. Ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick has been criminally charged with sexual assault after the Catholic Church found him guilty of molesting a child at a wedding reception. McCarrick is the first cardinal in the United States to be criminally charged, as all other issues have been dealt with by the church. Think about that, by the church. McCarrick faces 3 counts of indecent assault and battery on a person over 14. Think about that for the moment. The church is dealing with its own sexual assault issues. I wasn't aware that the church was a legal device or had any elements in legal society. That person who was sexually assaulted by that church is part of our country, our legal system. They have rights, just like every other person in this country has rights. And if those rights were violated, it doesn't matter if the person was a person of the cloth or anything else. His cloth is just his job. At the end of the day, we wouldn't accept any other job molesting kids and then just getting a pass on it with a job or internal dynamics of the job. Deal with the legal aspects of the fact that this kid has just been molested. It is extraordinary. And the fact that he's the first is unfortunate, to put it mildly. And even read that headline, this issues in the past have been dealt with by the church. That's an astonishing statement. That is an astonishing statement. Washington, D.C. has reinstated the mask mandate for both vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. This also comes as Pelosi's gave instructions to Capitol Police to arrest anyone who does not comply with the mandate on Capitol grounds. D.C. is the latest area to reinstate the mandate following Nevada, Los Angeles, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Cape Cod, St. Louis, and Kansas City. This also watching the walkout of Republicans yesterday because they didn't necessarily want to deal with the mask mandate. Think about that. Just think about that. The economies of Germany and France are growing again in the second quarter of this year, although their economies haven't grown enough to reach pre-pandemic levels. In contrast to the United States, they seem to have slightly tighter purse strings. However, we have been spending bank. And at the end of the day, countries in Europe, well, they're under the auspices of the European Union and have certain spending requirements or spending guidelines that they can't go beyond. If you remember, back during the time where the Yellow Vest movement was in play, France was trying to spend more money on its economy, but had to get permission in order to do so. The same thing with Italy. Italy was denied that permission to spend the extra money on the economy, in which case there was a fight between the European Union and Italy. I guess I'm making the point that, yes, we're far freer with our purse strings. We're a sovereign currency. They're not. South Korea's central bank says North Korea's economy has undergone its deepest losses in more than 20 years, a 4.5% contraction, wow, due to the effects of the pandemic and ongoing sanctions. It's hard to quantify that or put that in perspective, but if we saw a 4.5% contraction in the United States, that number would be astonishing. I mean, if we're thinking about our economy, we may get like a 2% increase and it's like, whoa, that's great. Imagine what a 4% decrease looked like, or 4.5%. That number is astonishing. The first person to be convicted under Hong Kong's new security law has been sentenced to 9 years in jail, having been found guilty of trying to support secession and engage in terroristic activities. More than 100,000 children could be facing life-threatening malnutrition in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray, a tenfold jump over previous years. Wow. It has been 2 weeks since the World Food Program was able to enter the Tigray region, and humanitarian experts say within 12 months, we could see massive deaths from malnutrition. Reading these stories are odd, just because I'll go through the headlines, I'll come back to it. President Rodrigo Duterte, and not odd as in bad, it's just background experience, where when you're living in DC or you're living in like Maryland, this is a melting pot in real terms. Meaning the people who work in my clinic, I don't think there are any white people in my clinic. All of them are either African, Philippines. I don't even think there are any Black Americans at my clinic. They're, from different places. People from Nigeria, people from, in this case, Ethiopia. And having conversations with them, because we cover news all over the world, well, I can talk to them about pretty much anything that's going on in their local country because we cover that stuff. And so having like background information of them telling you stuff behind the scenes or things that are going down or the history of the country and stuff like that, it gives this kind of weird take when I'm reading the headlines, and things will come up within the headlines where I'm like, yeah, but, or yes, but that's nuanced, and it's just very strange. That's all. President Biden said the first flight of Afghan interpreters who work within the United States has landed in the United States. And of course, the reason for that is the concerns that the Taliban will take out vengeance on them for working with the U.S. in Afghanistan. President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has restored the visiting force agreement with the United States, which allows the United States to rotate troops through the country as they engage in war drills and military exercises. President Duterte has previously planned to withdraw from the deal and engage more closely with China. So far, the medal leaders in order are the U.S., number 1, China, Russia, Japan, and Australia. We're going to say Russian athletes because they're participating under the Russian, Olympic
ROC,
Committee.
Russian Olympic Committee.
Russian Olympic Committee banner. China has the most gold medals with 18. Japan follows at 16, and the U.S. with 14. Scarlett Johansson is suing Disney over, basically, she is in Black Widow, the movie. Well, the deal apparently was that they weren't supposed to have both of these things going on at the same time, meaning both movie releases, because the idea is that if you put both movies out with her, that one could eat the other. Meaning people will go to see one, but wouldn't necessarily spend time seeing the other because both of them are basically out at the same time.
And she's saying it cost her over $50 million American dollars.
Wow.
A lot of money.
That is a lot of money.
And that's just her sliver of the very large pie that is the these Disney superhero movies, Marvel movies.
Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yes.
I just want to throw one other quick headline in here. This is about the Spotify CEO. He's basically said that he doesn't believe the platform should have it doesn't believe that it has editorial responsibility over podcasts. So sort of
planting a flag. People can say whatever they want.
And this has to do specifically with Joe Rogan and the Joe Rogan Experience, which, if you know, the few who don't know Joe Rogan,
you can go into some out there topics.
Fairly well-known comedian who started a podcast, used to be host of Fear Factor, started a podcast a while back, about a decade ago, over a decade ago at this point. It has become like the most successful podcast in the world.
Astonishing.
I think literally the most successful podcast in the world. But regardless, it's up there and it's successfully astonishing. For the longest time, it was on YouTube. Then he got like $100 million deal with Spotify, and he's been doing it through there. There were some weird things there because internally, Spotify employees they were successfully took certain episodes down. They were angry about some of the guests he was having on and the topics he was talking about because Joe Rogan goes all over the place and you can have Alex Jones on one day. And
that's what makes him popular.
That's what makes him popular.
The American public tunes in and they know they're going to get an honest take from Joe Rogan whether they agree with him or not.
They get the sense that they're hanging out with a dude who has interesting friends, having interesting conversations about things that
smoking pot, drinking, just
men
talking.
Specifically are often into.
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, they're sort of planting their flag. They don't believe they have editorial responsibility. In other words, they're not a publisher, right?
And the wild part is, Joe Rogan is not putting anything out that is so extreme where I'm like, I need to take that down. And if you're there, check yourself. Something's wrong. I mean, if you want to make an argument that Alex Jones talking about the Parkland shooting stuff and all that other stuff, or if he came out screaming like, the COVID is not real, and fair enough. If he is doing things that are getting people killed, you have a much better argument as opposed to Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
I don't think you have any argument for Joe Rogan being taken down or taking this stuff off or any of that stuff. Joe Rogan is just, like you said, a dude that is having conversations that would be no different than if you had dudes in your room and you guys were just smoking, drinking, and just talking. That's all Joe Rogan is.
For some reason, you were friends with Alex Jones.
Well, that's it, right. I'm wagering that everybody has a screwball friend, or maybe. I mean, some people are more...
Hopefully.
Some people are more, judgmental than others. But you get my point. That show is so good. And I made the point that be careful with Joe Rogan when he's interviewing you, because Joe Rogan has this interview style that is so disarming. It's like, I'm asking you a question, I have you another question, and we're just talking, we're just guys, we're just bros. And then you say something that piques his interest where he asks the most simple question in the world that doesn't tend to get asked, and the person can't answer it in a typical way. Like Jordan Peterson, perfect example. Jordan Peterson gets on Joe Rogan. Rogan is not attacking Jordan Peterson like some of the left-wingers do. He's just having a conversation with him. And Jordan Peterson says something where he hits his head on, where Joe Rogan is like, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, you're saying that people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and everything else, but what about these guys who you're basically saying that we should give all of this attention to, and these white males that are alienated and everything else? And Peterson, not being attacked, answered like a human being. Yeah, that's a problem with my thinking. And I was like, whoa.
Hey, that's an actual conversation.
There's
some humility there. That's what you would want to hear in a debate in some
I
sense.
want him to be a human being saying, you're right.
Yes, you're right. There's this whole here. I'm working on it. I'm trying to figure that out. But.
Or look, maybe I'm biased on this thing. And I'm just, I'm a person. I like that. I like that conversation. And so I get that sometimes when you're having conversations like that, there are going to be things that the person says that you might not like. So Joe Rogan famously, the trans thing, he's like, look, trans athletes, man, this is a problem. You shouldn't have men transitioning into women, basically fighting other women. This is a problem. He's very clear about that. And he's anti-transphobic. So it's like...
Just transphobic.
Transphobic, I'm sorry.
You're good.
But my point is, like, he gives you, this is just my take. Like it, hate it, I'm just the guy, I'm just the bro, giving you my take. And oftentimes, they are bright. They are thought out. You may disagree with him because he doesn't necessarily have the full context of stuff, but he's just the guy giving you his take. And oftentimes, he is far more intellectual than people give him credit for. So I have no issue with it. And yeah, Spotify shouldn't be taking him down.
It's true. And he's been targeted by like mainstream publications trying to take him out. I don't listen to him regularly, but my brother and I have listened to him sometimes. I think I listened to the full Alex Jones interview, which was incredible.
Yeah.
It was a spectacle.
Fascinating stuff, right?
Exactly.
When them two were fighting, and Alex Jones was like, I'll beat yours, that type of stuff. Oh, man. It's the funniest stuff.
Anyway. Anyway.
Alex Jones was like a 30-minute thing going after Joe Rogan in one of the great... Look, say whatever you want to say about Alex Jones. Whatever you want to say about him. He is one of the best at what he does, whatever that is.
He is very entertaining.
He is very entertaining.
I met the dude a couple of times.
Have you? Yeah. What did you think of him? Like, do you think it's an act? I always thought the guy's a showman. It's an act. He's putting it on. He gets there and he's just so good at it. He just does it. And it's like for the Joe Rogan one, he gets on. I don't know if he prepped. I don't know if he had what he was going to think about in advance. He just goes on for 30 minutes and just does it. And you're like, I don't know what's taking place here, but it's phenomenal. And you can't take your eyes off of it because he's that good. He did one where he was talking about Syria. Oh, that was the one. When Trump attacked Syria, and Alex Jones came out and attacked Trump for 30 minutes, saying that they were fighting the fascists. Like, he's screaming and, like, going after him. Yeah. He was like, they were helping us fighting the Taliban. I mean, the terrorists, the ISIS. They were killing people, and we were fighting them, and blah, blah, blah. He's losing it for 30 minutes on this, and you can't take your eyes off of it. Like, it's like maybe a 5-minute segment where he's kind of, like, slowing down, where it's like, all right, maybe he's lost the thread. And then he gets us the thread. He's like, he's back, he's back. It's fascinating stuff, man. This is not a rah-rah for Jones. This is a acknowledgement of skill. Even if it's where it's like, all right, that's kind of a skill. That's a skill. Random people can't do that.
It's true. He's intensely skilled. And to answer your question, yes, he's a showman, and yes, it's also genuine. It's
real.
It's
you
both.
think that's a there?
It's a yes and 100%.
Wow.
Yeah, in the same way that it's not like, okay, so I exaggerate my personality on the radio sometimes slightly, I guess.
Well, see, me, I'm just me. My wife would just be like,
Yeah, I have this sense of myself, and so like I can hear myself, and then I push it a little bit further or whatever. And I'm sure that he does the same thing. You're responding to this, this not mirror image, mirror neuron version of like, okay, what's this imagined entity, this abstract audience thing, thinking, who do I want to be? Who do I want to love? Me personally. It's this weird thing. With Alex Jones, I'm guessing he does the same thing. He feels a lot of this stuff genuinely. When he's given the impassioned spiel about Syria for half an hour,
I think he means it.
It's coming from a place.
Yeah, he seemed to mean
but
that.
He also he turns the volume up a little bit. That's natural. Not coincidentally, for some reason, I'm bringing it up. Met Alex Jones, met Andrew Breitbart back in the day, and then I've been in the homes, and I've met and briefly hung out with both Kevin Smith, the director, and James Cameron, the director.
Kevin Smith would be an interesting place to hang out.
Clerks.
Yeah,
Clerks back in the day, and Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back and all that, and of course James Cameron.
Where the weed,
Titanic, Terminator.
What the weed, bro?
Some of that.
If I'm at Kevin Smith's house, you
cool
better
place.
have the bowl of pot.
What I will tell you, Kevin Smith is known as, specifically with Clerks, it's like, okay, indie film.
Yeah.
Early 90s, you have somebody without big studio backing.
It's a movie about nothing, but it's a funny movie.
Bootstrapping and starting something up and doing it on a low budget and making something that works. It's like, okay, I could do that. Particularly talented individuals without connections watching that are like, hey, I can do that kind of thing. And so you have this wave of, in the 90s specifically, low budget filmmakers coming in. My point, I say all that. Going into Kevin Smith's house, I remember I met him because my dad interviewed him.
Yeah.
In this big room where we're doing the interview, maybe 13 or 14 at the time, on the wall behind him where he's sitting, it is filled with tapes and DVDs. It's a big wall. It's like 20 feet tall, like a tall ceiling, 30 feet wide wall, like bookcases filled with VHS tapes, DVDs, all of the things he's collected and watched.
Yeah.
My point is, he is a savant or whatever. He's into that stuff. He gets in really hard. So, a picture of Kevin Smith's life and mind.
Oh, no, I'm teasing about the pot just because of Clerks.
Yeah.
The Clerks thing was such... My wife, I think my wife turned me on to that movie, and I'm sitting there like, this is basically a movie about nothing, even though it's a really funny movie.
Yes.
Like those sometimes those movies work. The key thing in that movie, and we're gonna have to close it, but the key thing in that movie was the thing where he found out that his girlfriend slept with all of these guys or gave these guys, oral, something like that. But it was like 30 people or 40 people, and he was like, should I feel some kind of way about this? Should I be bothered by this? And he's like talking to his bro, and it's these type of weird conversations. But that movie was just funny. Kevin Smith, man, those are fascinating people to meet. James Cameron, what was that like?
Oh, it was just it was a big party thing because I'd started in Ghost of the Abyss. I hadn't started. I'd been an extra in Ghost of the Abyss. I was one of these people. My uncle is a Titanic artist, like a world-renowned Ken Marshall, my uncle on my mom's side, world-renowned Titanic artist. James Cameron, of course, directed the Titanic. Right. James Cameron and my uncle went down in a small submarine. I forget the specific name for it or whatever.
I remember
to see the Titanic. Yeah. It was like, if you see photos of James Cameron down there, my uncle's in the same thing with him. Yeah. He's going down as a sort of consultant. So anyway, through these connections with my uncle, some family of mine and I were extras in Ghost of the Abyss, which is this sort of semi-nonfiction fiction fictionalization of the events of the Titanic, directed by James Cameron. It's this weird thing. So I was in this. We all got invited out to his house and hung out and watched screenings in his personal private theater and stuff. And it was interesting.
Did you get camera time?
No. Oh, wait, you mean in the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Just a little bit.
It's called Ghost of the Abyss. All right, we gotta find that. Gotta find that. Gotta find that.
I'm a little chubby kid.
Gotta find that. Even more. But look, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to come back with a guest that I am uber excited about. Professor Avi Loeb and he's going to tell us about the Galileo Project. This is the project where they are basically scanning the stars for evidence of UFO previous communities and societies. Back in a moment. Fault lines.
Fault lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. The Galileo Project has just been announced. I think it was maybe a week ago. And the Galileo Project is basically a project. I have a conversation about the Galileo Project and its study of basically UAPs, or UFOs if you want to call it, and the search for extra alien civilizations or alien civilizations and artifacts that could have potentially been left in space. We're joined with Professor Avi Loeb. He received a PhD in plasma physics at the age of 24 from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and was subsequently a long-term member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he started to work in theoretical astrophysics. In 1993, he moved to Harvard University, where he was tenured 3 years later. He is now Frank B. Bard Jr. Professor of Science and former chair of the department and the person who's heading the private project, looking for extra alien or extra Earth civilizations, not to mention investigating UAPs. Professor Loeb, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, did I say any of that wrong? Because I want to make sure that I'm accurate when I'm talking about this, because I'm fascinated by this. And I think this is something that I've been screaming about for a very long time. I've been arguing that physics, science, should investigate UAPs. And that the fact that the ODNI report came out and you're getting all of this new information and all of this data, well, science is literally observation. And in this very specific situation, the environment to which we typically engage in has changed. And you have huge amounts of observation from the standpoint of technology and from the standpoint of the human element, multiple human observers in many of these cases that can't be easily and readily explained. And the fact that the ODNI report kind of makes the point that this is not us makes it that much more readily, makes it that much more of a question. So the fact that you're doing this, I love this. It seems that you're changing or trying to change the assumption in science that this is not real to there is a they there, and we need to look for this.
Yeah, well, you are not the only one. In fact, the head of NASA, Bill Nelson, shortly after the report came out, appeared on CNN and said that scientists should look into that. And the point is,
good job.
The point is that you wouldn't ask a plumber to bake you a cake, and by the same token, you wouldn't ask politicians or military personnel to explain what we see on the sky.
Exactly.
This is the job of scientists. And I approached people under Bill Nelson shortly after he made this statement, but never got a response. But fortunately, a week later, a few individuals approached me and offered a total of nearly $2 million for research on this subject. And I assembled a team of exceptional astronomers and scientists, and we are now planning to use telescopes to get a better sense of what the nature of UAP is.
And this is called the Galileo Project.
Well, it's called Galileo Project, and the reason that it's called that way is because Galileo Galilei argued that the Earth may be moving around the sun at the time when everyone believed that the sun moves around the Earth. And the philosophers at the time refused to look through his telescope. They said they know the truth. Today,
that's what science is doing. That is literally what science is doing on this subject, where science is basically saying there's nothing to see here, so we don't need to investigate. And it's like, dude, your world has changed. What do you mean there's nothing to see here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say you need extraordinary evidence and then not invest any funds or effort in the search, because then you wouldn't find anything. It's like shutting off the curtains on your windows and not looking out and claiming that you have no neighbors. That makes little sense. And what we are doing here is breaking that mold and basically looking into the subject after 70 years of report. Scientifically, meaning assembling open data that is not obtained by government-owned censors, so it's not classified, and the analysis would be completely transparent. Now, we need roughly 10 times more funds in order to get it, a very thorough analysis of enough of the sky for a long enough time. So my hope is that we will get more funds, but at the moment, we can definitely demonstrate that we get very valuable data, and we're planning to put telescopes in various locations, and they would be connected to cameras that would get the video of the sky, and there would be a huge amount of data coming in, and it would be filtered by computer systems that will look for objects of interest and then track them. And that's the way science is done. You measure things with instruments. You don't rely on eyewitness testimonies or on cameras that are jittery in a cockpit of a fighter jet. What you need to do is have full control over your instruments, and that's the plan of this project.
Is anybody else doing, specifically you're describing having satellites effectively pointing outwards, and I say satellite, it could be a telescope based on the Earth, but effectively using visual detection, looking for weird phenomena out there. SETI, as far as I know, they're largely doing sonic stuff, right? They're sending out auditory messages. And I mean, we've done some very extremely limited things, like sending the gold-plated record out in Voyager. We've done limited things to extend ourselves out into the universe. But the main other entity that I'm aware of doing this kind of work, in a broad sense, is doing it with audio. You're doing it with video. Is that a useful summary, and is that accurate, Avi?
No. What SETI did over the years, for almost 70 years, SETI is short for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. What they did is look primarily for radio signals coming from distant planets. And that's, in my mind, not the optimal approach, because just like trying to have a phone conversation, you need the counterpart to be alive in order to have a conversation. And if most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun. So it could have been that most cultures predated us. They're not around anymore, but they sent out debris into space. And we can find that. Just like doing archaeology, you find objects that were left behind. And, these objects could be quite intelligent if they're equipped with artificial intelligence. We already have self-driving cars. You can imagine a civilization more advanced than us by 100 years that would have sent into space AI systems that are completely autonomous. You can think of them as kids that you educate. You basically give them the blueprint for how they should behave with the world. You give them the rules and the purpose of their life, so to speak, and then you send them out, and they would operate on their own, just like kids going to the world. And then such systems could have been sent a billion years ago, and you could imagine them replicating themselves with 3D printers. So, in fact, they could fill up the Milky Way galaxy, and we don't know if something like that happened. The only way to find out is by looking at the sky.
Avi, I love this conversation. You have no idea, because I've been on the soapbox of science needs to be involved. Science needs to be involved. And it was always aggravating to me that it wasn't. It just seems like the thing that explains your world is the scientific community. That's their job. That's almost like a philosophical thing. And they have decidedly not been a part of this conversation. And part of that, it's been like 80 years. What these guys have been saying is all swamp gas. There's nothing to see here. And that's clearly not true. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like there's something there. And I think for me, there's a question. And there's a question that needs to be answered. There's a question that has been put on the table. There is a box that has been added to our world and to our environment by the ODNI and intelligence services. I mean, the conversation that you're just having right there, when you were basically saying, look, there could have been a civilization billion years ago, millions of years ago. They could have had AI. That AI could have replicated itself. It's a black box. And I think that's the most fascinating thing to me about this. It's a question mark.
It's like a fishing expedition. You know, you send out the hook, you don't know what you will find. And unfortunately, the scientific community is pushing it out of the mainstream. And that's unfortunate because the public cares a lot about this question. And I have a proof for that. I got funded without any fundraising. I got these $2 million without doing anything other than talking about the significance of having a vision about this subject. And moreover, I got thousands of emails since this project was announced a few days ago from people wanting to contribute and help and get engaged in the project. So I rest my case.
Yeah.
This is a subject that would attract funds and would attract people to science. So why should the scientific community shy away from it? This should be mainstream at the center stage because it's such an important question whether we are the smartest kid on the block. You know, we need to find out.
Or if we're being visited. Or like just a very basic, are all of these military videos, are all of the things that the people are saying, are all of the data that these guys have behind the scenes? Meaning, what is that? Even if you find a terrestrial answer for it, you still should find an answer for it. That's the part that gets me about this, and that's the part that aggravates me. There's a question here. Harness your curiosity, as the people say.
That's exactly the point. We will learn something new, irrespective, by collecting data, by looking. The worst thing we can do is just ignore it and say business as usual. And in that way, we will never learn anything new. You know, my approach is similar to that of a kid. You know, you tell a kid what the truth is, and the kid says, no, I want to figure it out myself. So, you know, that's pretty much the privilege of doing science, that you can collect your own data. You know, the sky is not classified, and you can reach the conclusions that are appropriate. And that's what we want to do scientifically with a group of scientists for the first time. You know, it's really surprising it was not done before.
It's true. Professor Loeb, another way of looking at this, please correct me because I have parts of this that might be wrong, but you're effectively detecting physical edge cases. You're detecting unusual phenomena. Now, that, you know, and I'm certain you're going to be looking for a little bit more specific types of unusual phenomena than just that. But the case, I think the point applies. You're looking for weird things that are popping up that might be evidence of alien life, but they could also just be currently unknown physical phenomena, astronomical objects, those kinds of things that you're detecting. What are you looking for specifically? And do you think you might be able to help science if you do, if what I'm saying is right, if you do, in the process of looking for life, discover, in addition to life potentially, just weird stuff that we didn't know about before that changes our view of how astronomy works, how objects form, what objects exist, that kind of thing? Professor Loeb.
Yeah, exactly. So just to give you an example, this object Oumuamua was the first one that came from outside the solar system that we identified close to Earth. And I have a book about it called The Extraterrestrial. And the point about this object is when people try to explain it as a natural object, they had to come up with ideas like a hydrogen iceberg, something that we've never seen before. So my point is, if it's something we've never seen before, and we get more evidence, we take a close-up photograph of a future object of the same class, you know, we will learn something new no matter what. And if it's artificial, if we see that it's a piece of equipment, it would be even more dramatic.
Of course, yeah.
And the point is, if there's one...
You're exactly right that we will learn no matter what. We will learn something new. And the way I think of it is like a fishing expedition. You should make the minimum number of assumptions about what kind of fish you will catch, because our imagination is limited to what we are producing. And, you know, if you were to introduce a cell phone to a caveman, the caveman would say, well, it's a shiny rock, because that's what caveman is used to playing with. So our imagination is quite limited, you know, and we shouldn't necessarily assume that we know what to find, what we will find. But we should look. That's the fundamental point. And we should look with scientific instruments. And I just don't understand why this is not, you know, there are hundreds of scientists doing it right now. I mean, what?
Do you think part of it is because they lump their lot in with there's nothing here? Meaning for 80 years, the scientific community that has had the job of observation has basically lumped themselves in with there's nothing to see here. It's all swamp gas. It's all, you know, interdimensional fish. It's just, you know, nothing. And then you find out that the government has basically said, okay, we were wrong. There is something here. And the government probably was lying. But what does it mean for the scientific community, whose job is observation, to basically miss the biggest thing ever? And how do they continuously justify their position considering the rest of the world has changed?
Right. No, but that's exactly what the philosophers did during the days of Galileo, and that's why we call it the Galileo Project. And you would think that people would learn the lesson, that, that science is a learning experience. We shouldn't assume we know everything. We should just look out and figure out what's going on, and if something looks unusual, unexpected, like the government. And by the way, the government job, people are getting paid in the intelligence agencies to figure out what flies in our sky.
Yeah.
And they come to Congress and admit that they are not doing their job. They see things that they don't understand. So that is a remarkable statement. But, people...
Well, the scientific community looks at that and says there's nothing to see here. No evidence. I was astonished by that. I contacted other scientists to try to get them to come on the show to talk about the scientific community's perspective on the ODNI report and the government's change from policy. These are people we give billions of dollars to protect our skies, to understand what is in our skies, and especially in the realm of national security. This report was astonishing, and yet the scientific community still had the perspective of, well, I don't see any new evidence. It's like, what are you talking about? All of these edifices that are supposed to be understanding what is in our skies and understanding this stuff is giving you that something is different, something has changed. And the community or the scientific community still doesn't seem to be on board. I guess I'm trying to get to why. What is underlying that? When you're talking to other scientists and they're seeing you in this project and everything else, what is underlying that notion of disinterest?
Well, it's the fact that people prefer to stay in their comfort zone and not learn something new. When Oumuamua was discovered, there was a seminar about it at Harvard, and when I left the room, one of my colleagues that worked on rocks in the solar system for many decades, he said, Oumuamua is so weird, I wish it never existed.
Oh, gosh.
It basically encapsulates for you the point that, they prefer to believe that they know everything and that there is nothing to be found. And here you are speaking with a scientist this morning that tells you otherwise. So not all scientists are the same. And I've assembled a group of, altogether it's about 50 people that will be working on this in the coming years. So we will change that situation, and hopefully we'll come up with some very interesting fish in our...
in your fishing expedition. So a couple of explanations here. One, there is some sort of institutional conspiracy to keep this suppressed. And that seems, frankly, extremely unlikely to me, considering the fact that you've had prominent members of the intelligence community, not to mention Bill Nelson himself, former senator, now head of NASA, himself, come out and advocate for looking into this stuff. So putting that explanation aside for a second, there's maybe a remnant of that. Regardless, there's definitely a sort of cultural taboo against seriously addressing this in the scientific community. On that point, is that taboo fully natural, or was it partly created and encouraged? Because this is a fringe subject, and maybe there is stuff that, the government doesn't want to look into or whatever. I guess from your perspective, is that taboo entirely natural, or was that cultivated or encouraged by higher authorities?
No, I think it's pretty much the psychology of the scientific community that resists change. And I've seen it many times in my career. I worked on other subjects, such as, the first stars in the universe. When was the scientific version of the story of Genesis? When was the first light produced? And when I worked on it, there were only a few people around the world interested, and I heard a lot of ridicule, and I moved on and created this field. Now is mainstream, and lots of people are working on it. And I did that also on imaging black holes, I worked on the nature of dark matter. There are all kinds of examples where you see the same phenomenon, but what's unusual here is that people take it very emotionally and also attack me personally when I discuss it. And that, I think, is inappropriate. Of course, we prefer to believe that we are the smartest, that there is nothing like us in the entire universe, but it would be a mistake not to check. After all, science is based on evidence, and we should just collect the evidence. So at this point, a month ago, I said, the hell with it. I'll just do it. I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. I'm not an observer, but I decided to go ahead and do it myself with a group of very exceptional scientists, and we will collect the data. We have exchanged numerous emails over the past few weeks. We are coming up with a concept for the instruments that we will use. You can buy them off the shelf, and we will just do it. You know, I had about 1,000 interviews over the past 6 months after my book came out, and in one of the recent ones, I spoke with King Princess, a singer, and she basically stated exactly the point. Let's just do it.
Yeah, it's just investigation. I don't get the like I said, there seems to be a heavy emotional tenor within the scientific community about this topic, and trying to get them over. So I hope you can break them over to bring them over to your side of the case. You know, the harnessing the curiosity. There's a question here that needs to be answered, and it's our job philosophically to do it. Something else I want to get to. What are your expectations of this investigation? I mean, I know Oumuamua has just gone through, and unfortunately, we saw it on its way out, so we didn't necessarily be able to get a really good look at it. But like you said, it's a weird artifact. And if you're right, that's not going to be the only artifact floating around through space. If we've seen one, there has to be others. What are your expectations for this investigation?
Well, the point is, it's not a philosophical argument. You see, there was a few weeks ago, there was an article published in Nature Astronomy magazine by a philosopher trying to make the case that Oumuamua is not a technological relic. And I said to myself, haven't we learned something since the days of Galileo? Because this is not a philosophical question.
It's yes or no.
Right. All we need is a high-resolution image, a megapixel image of the object. That's it. You know, because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. We wouldn't need to write the book. We wouldn't need to speak about it if I could have shown you a megapixel image of Oumuamua. And the same is true about UAP. That's what we want to get. We want to get a high-resolution image that will show whether it's a natural phenomenon in the atmosphere, whether it's an object that looks like natural, or whether it has bolts on it and you can read off the label.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Have you considered trying to go to the government to get them to release that to the scientific community?
No. Well, okay. So I don't want to look at classified data whatsoever, because it will I will not be free to speak about it afterwards, and it will limit my ability to deal with new data. But of course, if the government wants to release, we will look at it. But otherwise, I don't want to engage in past data that was collected by instruments that were not optimized. No, we can do a much better job within the scientific community, and we can make the data open and the analysis transparent. It's about time that we stop obsessing with classified data that nobody gives us. And
why is it classified? Why would a picture of Oumuamua be classified?
Oh, not Oumuamua. We're talking about UAP.
Okay, pardon me. Thank you.
That data is classified because it was taken by government-owned sensors. Not so much because the data itself is classified. It's because the data was obtained with sensors that are classified, and you don't want adversaries, other nations, to know what we use to monitor our sky.
But that puts us kind of in a weird corner, doesn't it? You either have to have privately funded satellites who are doing this detection, as I suppose are you. That is effectively what you're doing, right? You're making this stuff publicly available in a way that only the government would have had access to. Is that correct, Avi?
Yeah, but we are not using satellites. We are using telescopes.
Thank you.
Looking to the side from the ground. But yes, that's exactly the point. We want to have our data open so everyone can see it. Everyone will be able to do to follow the analysis that we are doing. It will all be transparent. You know, that's the way science operates. Science doesn't hide. There is no point in hiding anything, because, you know, if we release the data, maybe someone somewhere will be able to analyze it in a way that is different than our analysis and find something else. You know, so it will all be open, and that's the beauty of doing science. You know, you're trying to figure out it. It's like figuring out a puzzle. You know, or acting as a detective. You have some clues. You try to figure out what they mean. And you know, with respect to these objects, we just need higher quality data.
We just need data.
That includes not just images. We will also use radar data and infrared data, and you know, we will try to get as much data as possible.
Avi, thank you. I appreciate this. I mean, because Shane can tell you, I've been screaming to high heaven that science needs to be engaged on this topic. And so the fact that you're trying to drag in there, kicking and screaming, it's like, look, here's the reality of this. I appreciate it. The voice that you have been listening to. And by the way, good work. I mean, good fortune on this. I really hope you do well and succeed on it. And please come back to give us a heads up about what has been taking place, meaning the progress of the project. So the voice that you guys have been listening to is Professor Avi Loeb. He received a PhD in plasma physics at the age of 24 from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was subsequently a long-term member of the Institute for Advanced Physics or Advanced Study in Princeton, where he worked in theoretical astrophysics, so I'm difficult time talking. In 1993, he moved to Harvard University, where he was tenured 3 years later. He is now Frank B. Bard Jr., Professor of Science and former chairman of the department. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and almost exactly a week later, I think that would be 119 hours later. No, more than that. Almost exactly a week later, we were joined.
Safer, yeah.
What'd you say?
That's safer.
It's 167 hours later if I'm actually doing it, but I'm doing this while I'm on the air. We were joined by Mallory McLaren, and my point is, she called in. Mallory, you called us in at, I believe, 9:45 last Friday. It's now 8:45 this Friday. It's almost exactly a week later. It's a dumb, awkward thing, but my point is, the timing is there. We're going to be talking about lab-grown meat. Mallory McLaren is an attorney and bioethics professor in South Florida. She's passionate about humanity's duties to the wide range of sentient creatures with whom we share Mother Earth. Mallory, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you guys?
Good.
So far, so good.
Good. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I will set it up like this. Last week, you called in. I had said something earlier on in the show before you called about lab-grown meat, and I mentioned, the hoi polloi, you're going to be eating lab-grown meat. And then you called in, you asked me about geothermal energy.
Basically, how dare you, sir?
I briefly got into that, and then you were like, Shane, you're completely wrong. It's not going to be for the hoi polloi. It's not going to be for the masses or the proletariat. It's going to be like, something that is actually pretty good. It's going to taste good, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to invite you on. You know what you're talking about. You've looked into this stuff. You've been researching this for years, and you're an advocate for it. Fascinating conversation to get into. Where did I go wrong? And what do you think lab-grown meat is going to look like? What should we even call it? Is it lab-grown meat? What's the term, Mallory?
Well, there's different terminologies for lab-grown meat. Of course, there is lab-grown meat. There's also in vitro meat products or in vitro animal products. And then there's also another term which has come into the conversation in the last few years, which is cellular agriculture. Now, of course, I understand that this may be an attempt to rebrand and to reframe the issue, because there's a huge ick factor among some individuals relating to their reaction.
If I'm being honest, I'm sitting here frowning.
And cellular agriculture seemed to elicit the worst response.
Yeah, it's like, ugh. But I'm sorry, but I don't mean to go there, and I wasn't going to say it, but yeah, there's an ick factor. I mean, but look, the ick factor is entirely relative, if we're being honest. I mean, we're basically talking about killing a cow, ripping out its entrails, ripping off the meat and the skin, and you know what I mean? So the ick factor is purely perspective. So, but please continue.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective here, my ick factor comes whenever I think about eating something that's been killed, and basically I'm eating part of a corpse, and I think about the life that animal lives.
Exactly.
in all likelihood, it lived in a cage. It lived in confines. It probably wasn't treated very well. And the thing is that these are most of the animals that we eat or the animal products that we consume come from animals that have some degree of sentience and sapience. And so my point of view is, and my point of view has been since I was a teenager, is that, you know, what right do I have to take those lives? You know, I'm not a perfect person, so I don't want to preface this by saying that I'm here to finger wag. But this is my own personal perspective on it, and it led me to do research on this, and particularly during that period of time whenever it became more apparent that the animal agriculture that we engage in on this planet has had a serious impact and is having an increasingly serious and substantial impact on climate change and lending a hand towards creating this climate emergency that we are almost at a place where we can't do that we will never be able to return from. So as of 2013, animal agriculture was responsible for around 17 to 18% of the total global anthropogenic contribution to greenhouse gases. And I just thought to myself, like, well, if there's something that we can do about that, like, we should be doing that. And so let's look at alternatives. Let's look at ways to give people what they want in their diets without doing this, without contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in the way that we were with the raising of and killing of animals. So
about 4 or 5 years ago, I was kind of close to that too, and for similar ethical reasons. And then I went and became a weirdo. But I was like, including the lab-grown meat thing, and obviously factory farming is horrible. And yes, the methane emissions are just terrible and constant. I think there are better ways of doing these things. So there are material arguments to have. There are also ethical ones to have. But the science is actually pretty interesting. Where are we right now in the science? How expensive is it to produce lab-grown meat, in vitro meat, meatless meat?
Wait, first, what does it mean?
Yeah, what would you say, Jamarl?
What does it mean? Like, what is like, what does it mean for intra-vitro meat?
What is it? Yeah. That's probably a good way to start, actually. Mallory.
So really quite simply, it is animal products that are stem cell derived. So the process, no matter what process you undertake to create the product, you're starting from taking myosatellite adult stem cells from animals, and then you're either using them in a 3D printer, for example. That's one option that's been put forth, and then there's another option to like create scaffolds to have these cells replicate on and to grow and to multiply to create an ultimate end product. Now, I also don't want to sit here and mislead you and say that we have lab-grown meat. It's just that we just don't see it in our grocery stores because it's only for the very rich right now. But there are a lot of technical challenges, and there's also a lot of regulatory challenges too. Don't forget that this ick factor definitely, and also entrenched interest in cattle raising and chicken farming and all of that, pig raising, are going to have impacts when these products go to the USDA or the FDA or similar agencies around the world to seek approval to be sold. But long story short, Jamarl, is that it's based on stem cells. So these are not GMO stem cells. These are just stem cells that are taken from an animal in a relatively painless process, and then they are multiplied until they result in a substantial enough product that we can eat.
And what do you mean by that? When you say they multiply, like, is it a blob of meat? Well, I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to get them, and I don't mean to say it like that. It's what it looks like in my head, because I'm thinking of like, what does chicken look like, and what does chicken look like if you just try to multiply? I don't know the I don't have an image of it.
Does it move? Can it speak?
Does it have bones and teeth? Like, where does the, like, when you're building this, or when this is being built and this is growing, how does it know what to grow into? Because it's not growing into a full cow, a full chicken. How does it know?
Correct. Yeah, no, the aim of these technologists who are working on this is they are just trying to create parts like musculature, because the majority of what we eat in terms of animal meat products is musculature.
Yeah, it's muscle with fat layered in between, basically.
Right. So I wouldn't call it a blob of meat, but I'm also not going to sit here and tell you that I've been inside the laboratories and I've seen with my own eyes what exactly they're doing. And since this is mostly an entrepreneurial effort, a lot of these processes are kept secret right now. They're trying to protect their intellectual property, those who are working on this stuff. But it's a similar technique than what we would be trying to do if we were trying to grow a new heart or a new kidney in a lab to help people to live longer, to replace damaged and diseased organs.
Well, and because for one thing, you don't need the cultivated meat to function. You don't need it to serve as a muscle. You don't need the fat to insulate or serve as an energy store, unlike a kidney or something that you're trying to print, which needs to serve the function of the organ that you're replacing, with.
That's right.
That makes perfect sense. That's a technical hurdle. But I want to come back. There's the economic line on this too. And granted, it's exploratory. It's too expensive to be used commercially. But on my point, the hoi polloi comment that I made, this is still how I see it going. What I see happening, when this gets cheap, it probably gets cheaper. It keeps getting cheaper. And then what you have are rich people who can afford to have the artisanally raised, grass-raised beef, whether it's Wagyu or just whatever. It doesn't need to be all that incredible, but it probably still retain those herds. My point is, the richer could afford and probably would choose to buy the actual cow, wouldn't they? If once the cost of the lab-grown meat gets low enough, then all of a sudden the real meat becomes a luxury because there aren't as many people ranching. There isn't as much availability of it. Now, I'm not talking in a decade. I'm talking maybe 50 years when the sort of supply-demand curves shift, something like that. Acting as if I know what I'm talking about. Mallory, what's your take on that?
You know what? You may be right, but I don't have a telescope into the future, and I can't really tell kind of what social messaging is going to be out there regarding this kind of people's choices in their diets, whether they're going to buy Wagyu or Kobe beef or something. I mean, now if I was a rich person and I had the opportunity to have in vitro meat products, I'm going to have those because I think that's going to make me feel better, and it's going to be a more pure product that isn't going to have been
murdered. The issue is murder, right? Murdered. I mean, that's our issue, murder. Like the fact that we're killing what is basically a life. Like it's something that looks like, well, kind of like me. It breathes, it has kids, it cares about those kids. It has a memory. It has things where it seems to care about X or Y. It seems like us. And we're killing it and eating it. And our justification for it is we're smarter, basically. So look, in 50 years, I hope you're right.
Yeah, and I wanted to just bring this back to the conversation you were having with Avi Loeb because, I think that if there are other civilizations that are observing us out there, I think that they are watching what we do and how we treat each other and the least of us. And, it's my personal opinion, that humans, as our position in the food chain and the animal hierarchy on this planet, we have responsibilities of stewardship over the animals and the other sentient beings on this planet, as well as to the actual planet itself. And I think that they're watching if they exist, and they're going to be evaluating us on that.
Interesting. I think the same argument would apply to a simulation in a weird way. There are these different, outside observer arguments that feel a lot more relevant or appropriate to bring up. They feel more justified at this point than they used to because functionally you can't prove them, but you get my point. Yeah. It's in the zeitgeist right now. And they're feeling that you were going to be judged, whether we've inherited that from the Judeo-Christian tradition or something, this idea of sin, or if it's just built into us, those totally apply. I'm just not sure that it's true. I think that this is the ultimate ethical thing, and we're out of time, so we've got to come back on this some other time. If you are ranching humanely and set aside, say you don't kill anything that you raise, you don't even eat anything that you raise, but you drink the milk of the cows that you're raising, they're living incredibly happy lives. You have chickens that live very happy lives. You eat their eggs. I'm talking vegetarianism here, but it's still consuming animal products. That seems like the best of both worlds. You have happy, healthy animals that get a chance to live great lives that you don't end prematurely at all. It's good for the environment, I would argue, and could argue. We've got to close it here, Mallory. But I guess my point is, I have another thing that we might want to come back to some other time, and hopefully we can have that conversation with you. Great talking. Mallory McLaren, attorney and bioethics professor in South Florida. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this week. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning and this week of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the surface of our increasingly divided, fragmented, embattled, scarred, blasted globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man clinging to the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, hanging by a thread from that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. No, I'm just kidding. Let's get into the headlines. Well, first of all, it's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It's July 30th, a Friday, and I hope everybody's having a great morning and has a great weekend, which we're, of course, about to head into. First up, though, in COVID news, high numbers this morning. In fact, the U.S. is sitting at the highest new case count of any country around the world. We are back in that number one position. All the Olympics are happening. This is a competition we didn't want to win. About 95,083 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 389 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 71,621 cases per day. That's an increase of 151% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 49% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 57% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 34,861,501 people across the United States, and it's killed 612,098 people. And again, this comes as the United States, crazy by new numbers, the largest number of new cases of any country for that day. And I'm getting the feeling that this won't be the last in the upcoming period. In national news, ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick has been criminally charged with sexual assault after the Catholic Church found him guilty of molesting a child at a wedding reception. McCarrick is the first cardinal in the U.S. to be criminally charged, as all other issues have been dealt with by the church. McCarrick faces 3 counts of indecent assault and battery on a person over 14. This was for a crime committed decades ago.
When you read that real quick, and I hate to intrude, what do you think about when it says the church dealt with these other cases, but the law finally deals with him? What does it make you think of? I mean, because it's like, okay, how many other cases? How many people had the church been dealing with? Meaning, if I am a person and my mom takes me to church and I get molested, I am also, first and foremost, a citizen of this country, the United States. I have certain laws, I have certain rights, and those rights and laws have just been breached because this guy has just molested me in some kind of way, touching a child inappropriately. How does the church, who has no legal responsibilities at all, meaning they don't have jails, they don't have sovereign power, they don't have any of that stuff, how are they making decisions in regards to what needs to take place for the guy that committed the crime? That's astonishing. I mean, that line, I read that and was like, that is astonishing. At what point did the church get voted into office where they can make laws and rules and procedures and deal with the criminal justice system? Were they putting this guy, or the previous ones, did they put him in prison? Or did they just move him to a different area so they can molest more kids? Yeah.
That seems to be how that has usually worked, is they move them around.
Utterly disgusting.
And it is disgusting. And again, I brought this up before, but the film Doubt, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman and I think Meryl Streep is his counterpart. Great movie. I remember watching this about exactly that. But I believe it's a priest who gets moved to another church, and it's a, intense, dramatic film. It's discovered he'd been moved because he had been molesting boys. He's moved there, he starts molesting boys again, and you discover that he's been moved. It's just been this cycle that he's been caught up in. Good movie on that specific subject. Specifically and legally, I don't know how, and I don't even know that that's how it works. Clearly, though, the church and state thing shouldn't extend to legal grounds. It's not that if I kill somebody in a church, the church has to decide whether I'm guilty of that. It's the law. There's
nobody would accept that.
That's not what's special about church, But moving on here, got more headlines. In national news, Washington, D.C. has joined many other cities in reinstating the mask mandate for both vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. This also comes as Nancy Pelosi gave instructions to Capitol Police to arrest anyone who does not comply with the mandate on the Capitol grounds. D.C. is the latest area to reinstate the mandate, following Nevada, Los Angeles, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Cape Cod, St. Louis, and Kansas City. In international news, the economies of Germany and France are growing again in the second quarter of this year, although their economies haven't grown to reach pre-pandemic levels. That's in contrast to the United States. They seem to have slightly tighter purse strings, however. We've thrown a lot more money into our stock market. South Korea's central bank says North Korea's economy has undergone its steepest losses in more than 20 years. That's a 4.5% contraction due to the effects of the pandemic and ongoing sanctions. The first person to be convicted under Hong Kong's new security law has been sentenced to 9 years in jail. They've been found guilty of trying to support secession and engage in terrorist activities. More than 100,000 children could be facing life-threatening malnutrition in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray. That's a tenfold jump over previous years. It has been 2 weeks since the World Food Program was able to enter the Tigray region, and humanitarian experts say that within 12 months, we could see massive deaths from malnutrition. President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has restored the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States. That agreement allows the U.S. to rotate troops through the country as they engage in war drills and military exercises. President Duterte had previously planned to withdraw from the deal and engage more closely with China, but apparently has about-faced on this one. President Biden said the first flight of Afghan interpreters who worked with the United States has landed in the U.S. They're being given asylum here. In Olympic news, so far the medal leaders in order are the United States, China, Russian athletes, Japan, and Australia. China has the most gold medals with 18. Currently following is Japan at 17, and then behind them, the United States with 14. In tech news, Scarlett Johansson is suing Disney over what she claims $50 million in lost income because Disney released a movie that she was starring in both on Disney Plus and in theaters at the same time, basically cutting her out of quite a bit of potential income there.
Black Widow, yeah.
Yes. So that's happening. Very attractive actress, of course. I remember growing up, had quite a bit of a crush on her.
Yes.
For a little while.
Very attractive.
Simultaneously, Spotify CEO has said that he does not believe that Spotify has editorial responsibility over the podcasts that are posted to the platform. This is almost certainly in reference to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. We were talking about this earlier. Controversial, even notorious podcast, some episodes of which have been removed from Spotify, and the existence of which on that platform, and a big, about $100 million deal, big deal for Joe Rogan. The existence of that podcast on that platform has itself come into question. So it's good to see, in my opinion, the Spotify CEO coming out and saying, hey, we're not going to do that kind of thing. We're not going to act as a publisher. We're not going to shut these people out just because we're coming under pressure or some employees want us to. That's censorship.
We're not playing that game. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the catch becomes when the rubber meets the road. It's like, hey, okay, all right, so let's all of the races that we can find meet at Spotify, like that stuff. Like, how far does that go?
Yeah.
If it gets to a point where it's a safe space for people who want to blow up stuff, is Spotify still like, all right.
That's a crime, though.
Yeah, but it's not a crime if you are just bringing people there to kind of talk about and to kind of dog whistle it. Like, meaning, is there going to be a space for people who are basically extremely, extremely hateful that can just show up on Spotify and that's their spot?
And
Spotify okay with that?
This is not the rubberiest part of the
exactly.
The rubber.
Like Joe Rogan is to me an easy. You back your guy.
You back that guy.
Yeah, you back that guy.
Yeah,
this is not controversial.
He's a big guy. This isn't Alex Jones, for instance.
No.
We've got at least we're done with headlines. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
There's one more we should add about Biden, and this one is Biden to federal workers get vaccinated or face restrictions. Yesterday, Biden came out on the new policy change. I'll just read it. President Biden announced Thursday that all federal workers and on-site contractors would need to be vaccinated against coronavirus or be required to wear masks and undergo repeated testing during the week, an order that would affect millions of workers and designed to be a model for their employers. And this is rippling, right? I mean, Google is doing it, Apple is doing it, and you have all sorts of hospitals that, to me, should have been doing it. Anyway, we talked about this in the first quarter, or the first part of the show. I think Shane and I might be in agreement on it. I am, look, this is one of those things where this is a horrible thing with the exception of everything else. Yeah, I agree with it. All things being equal. I would probably fall into agreement with a lot of the libertarians who are dodgy about this. By the same token, you got to make a choice in life. And my choice on this would be, yes, this is right.
And I guess if there's a libertarian who's dodgy about this on like specifically libertarian grounds, not just because they're suspicious of the whole lockdown thing in general, but like suspicious of just this.
Yeah.
I don't know on what grounds they'd be super suspicious of this because you're giving
They don't like the government telling them that they need to do X or Y.
They don't need to do X or Y. These are people who are voluntarily working for the government. They know that the government is the government. And then even then, it's not that the government
working for the government.
It's true.
They are voluntary. I mean, that's like saying somebody's
work.
voluntarily working anywhere, which is on some level true.
It's true. They're choosing to work for this entity, and they can choose to quit if they don't like what it's asking.
Right there. That's the catch. And that's the catch where people are like, where it's always dog whistle. It's like, I mean, Pony Show. Yes. If you don't like Google, YouTube, Facebook, go somewhere and make your own show. Make your own platform.
That's not the same thing.
That is the exact same thing.
No, it's not.
How is it different?
How many other social media companies are there than Facebook?
Well,
name them.
I am making a choice to work at a particular place.
But name them.
Name the most social media companies?
Yeah, other than Facebook.
What does it matter?
There are no other options.
You can build your own option.
The government is a job.
You are
there are thousands. There are so many other entities.
You're choosing.
It doesn't. There's not. It's not
the
analogous.
Same thing. You're choosing. It's the same thing. You're choosing to go on a platform. You can always go and build your own platform. You can build another YouTube. You can build another platform. Twitter. You can build another Facebook.
The libertarians would argue they can build another government too.
When you're working at a particular company, and like you say, it's your choice. You can choose to work at that company, the other companies, everything else.
I get where you're coming
from.
Most
of the time, people don't like to lose their jobs. And when you have a job saying, hey, you need to get vaccinated, and you have many of these other companies that are basically following suit, yeah, your choices in that are constrained.
Totally, but from a libertarian
perspective, quit and go hungry.
I get it, but from a libertarian perspective, nobody's rights were violated. Nobody did anything to oppress anybody else.
Nobody's rights were violated by getting kicked off social media either, Shane.
It's true, but what's particularly troublesome about that is that the government is working with social media to do this stuff, to kick people off. I think that's where
working with these companies
libertarians justifiably get squicked out. What companies? I wasn't talking about companies.
What do you mean? I'm saying the government is pushing. It wants these companies to back them.
But we were talking about the government, not other companies.
Okay, I'm missing your point now.
My point, on the one hand, it's irrelevant. My point really was your analogy doesn't work. You don't have countless options for other social media platforms besides Facebook and Twitter.
That's what I'm saying. You can go build your own.
Those own the space there, basically. Okay, no, but I don't need to build a business. The choice isn't government or building my own business. I can go work with McDonald's. I could start my own business. I can go work down at the local corner store. My point is that the analogy doesn't work. And I don't mean to be a stickler,
but dude, I mean, whether you're working at the government or working at a private business, what's the difference? Your private business, if they say you need to get a vaccine to get to be employed here, all right, well, that creates a problem for people who are working there.
It's true.
And from my point.
From the libertarian perspective, they can do that. If the government forces them to do that, that's when stuff gets seriously bad. But any business can say, from a libertarian perspective, again, they can say that. I don't want you working here if you're not going to do X.
Yes.
That kind of thing. From a libertarian perspective, that is perfectly okay. So what's the problem? And my point is, I guess, that from a libertarian perspective, a lot of the stuff that you said were sounded ridiculous or whatever. I forget how we got into this conversation. But
what did I say sounded ridiculous?
That's the thing. I forget how we got into this now. We just got into it.
I don't know what I said sounded ridiculous. I don't even know if I used the word ridiculous. I do know that from the standpoint of this, I have qualms with being pushed on stuff like this, even though, I end on the side of, I think it's right. So I can see people feeling some kind of way. But the thing is, if I'm coming to work and let's say it's a restaurant, and you say, look, I want to keep the people safe in the restaurant. I've been vaccinated. I want the other people to be vaccinated. It is not wrong, per se, for the restaurant owner to say, if you're not vaccinated, I don't want to take the chance of you infecting my other patrons, that type of stuff.
Totally.
So it gets, I understand why it's taking place, even if though I have qualms about it. I guess it's their part. There was another story associated with this one. After 3 weeks of silence, the White House is now saying, just 3 days before the eviction moratorium expires, that they want Congress to extend it but can't do it themselves. Now, this has to do with a ruling, if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court ruling that basically said the administration can't just basically extend with the CDC guidelines. And so now, with 2 days to go, an eviction moratorium is about to expire. What is Congress going to do? Nothing. We're talking about like a fourth. Like, if I remember, when the headline, I think it was like a fourth of the public was in the rears in regards to rent and facing eviction. And just 3 days beforehand, with the White House not saying anything up to this point about it, now it's like, hey, you guys need to do something with the eviction stuff. You got 2 days. Get to work. Days.
Yeah, and with BlackRock owning more homes than ever, that will end well.
Yeah, this is going to be problematic. The Biden administration wants to give states and cities $100 to get vaccinated. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a good idea? I mean, that's basically get the pickup truck and get your vaccine, or too far?
I think it'll work with quite a few people. It just won't be enough, but it'll get more people vaccinated. And it's, kind of expensive, but I guess if it's an emergency pinch mode, you push for what you want to do. But there are a lot of people who are like, I wouldn't take $100. I wouldn't take $1,000 to put that thing in my body because they think it's going to make them infertile or whatever. They have these beliefs about what it's going to do, or they just don't trust it. And frankly, $100, unless you're incredibly desperate, if you're measuring that against your life, it's like, okay, a lot of people are just going to shut that off. So I think in some sense, I get why he's trying to do it.
But he might
can call it noble, but it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be anywhere close to enough.
Very interesting. And before we close, the chess thing. Chess is a sport.
It's just not athletic, Jamarl.
Well, it is. It is. Like, all right, so let's say you're sitting down. It looks like you're just sitting there, but you're using incredible brain power. You have no idea. Like, if they could do an MRI of your brain, it would just be on fire. They'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this person is
light bulbs in the room next door light up.
Lights off.
Exactly.
And it's like you are spending, I mean, there are times you're sitting there for 6 hours in this intense struggle where you are like mentally struggling. But keep in mind, the mental aspect of that is not magic. It is grafted on a physical body that has to have the capability of you to make that choice, of to look for that move, to be able to, the physical vigor and stamina to sit there and do it with a brain that is expending massive amounts of oxygen in order to make that work. 6 hours. And it's like, after that, you have another game, 6 hours. The endurance, the mental capability, the mental,
so
the fatigue and everything else associated with it.
If I weigh 800 pounds and I become a chess master, can I say that I'm an athlete?
There are no 800-pound chess masters.
Wait.
And I don't even think there could be.
Okay, what about a 600-pound chess master?
There are none. And I don't think there could be.
What about a 400-pound chess master? Because this is starting to get into the realm of like, I could probably find one of these people.
So
I'm not just talking statistical abnormalities.
Let's say a 500-pound chess master. The guy is just phenomenal at chess.
He's phenomenal at chess, but he's absolutely out of shape. He doesn't have a single muscle in his body.
Right.
His bones are pulp.
Can he be an athlete?
Can he be an athlete? Is he an athlete?
No, because he would never be a chess master.
No, come on, Jamarl.
No, because the problem is...
That is literally the no true Scotsman fallacy. That is literally the no true Scotsman fallacy. I'm not kidding.
Chess player.
That is literally...
Well, let me explain what I mean by that. When I started back playing chess, I had went back, I had started back getting good, all of that stuff, the works. And I went to a tournament. And I sat there the first game, I did phenomenal. I'm like, yes, I'm back. The second game, worse. Third game, worse. Fourth game, why are you here? Because fatigue, it's like the physicality associated with it matters. Your ability to look for a move, your ability to just sit there and just have I'm going to search for this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to push for this, requires stamina and energy. I don't think that proverbial 450-pound chess master can sit there game after game after game in these kind of high competitive things and do what he does. That'd be shocking to me. If he does, then yes, I'll say he's an athlete. If he can't, then I'm going to say no, he's not. That's where I'm at. Is the person expending brain power, Shane?
Of course.
Are they moving their muscles in their arms?
It's famous mathematicians, notoriously, if you look at them, often they're pretty skinny because not only do they eat slightly less than normal people, but they think a lot. They think pretty hard. And it's not just chess. It's any constant thinking. You're right. Your brain is just chugging through that oxygen. It is on fire. It's eating that oxygen. And, and all these different categories it applies. But are they athletes?
What is it? Define athlete.
There's literally the term like mathlete as a joke, and I get it.
No, but define athlete.
I mean, I could look it up. I'm going to look it up.
Go for it.
I don't want to come up with my own definition.
Well, I just want the specific definition that you're using to say that chess players are athletes.
Okay, quote unquote, a person who is proficient in sports and other forms of physical exercise. If you're going to say that chess is a physical exercise.
No, I say it's a sport.
Okay. And other forms of physical exercise?
And other.
Are board games sports?
No, it depends on
then
how
what's the
engaged.
line?
It depends on how engaged.
If chess is just an extremely archaic form of Monopoly with more developed rules.
Is the same thing as throwing things that are just moving.
Now I have truly touched.
That's the analogy that you're going to use.
God. I've soiled the temple.
If that's the analogy you're going to use, no, those things are dramatically different. If somebody is just going and playing checkers, no. If they're playing checkers competitively, yes. It's the distinction. If I am just playing basketball, am I really an athlete? If I'm just 400 pounds just throwing the ball up on the thing, am I an athlete doing that, Shane? 400-pound guy, just free throws. Is that guy an athlete?
If he's the best at it, yeah.
The best at it?
Yeah.
So you could be a 400-pound best free throw shooter. The only thing you're doing is standing on the line and just putting it. You're not running up and down the field. You're not doing anything else.
Yeah, because you have extremely solid physical skills. And again,
it sounds like you're just overweight.
Okay, but if he's able to do the free throws better than anybody else, then I'd call that person an athlete. Think about the fine motor coordination.
Okay, but what does it mean to be able to move pieces, to coordinate, to be able to do it?
But is that what wins it? Because I can move, my pawn is perfectly in the center of this square and move it perfectly to the center of that one. That's not how it works.
That the thing that makes Michael Jordan a phenomenal athlete is just his physical capability.
Of course not.
Exactly.
But
all
here's
of those
the thing, man.
things are
Here's
part
the
of
thing,
it.
man.
Meaning
Tennis and basketball are physical and mental. Chess is only mental. The brain power that you're sucking through.
It's not that much mental.
Come on. It's not.
Tennis
come on.
And basketball are mental sports.
Yes, they are.
No, they're
Planning,
not.
plotting.
Those things are physical sports.
Okay, now you sound dismissive. Now you're dismissing basketball.
Look, I am giving an element to it where the person has to think about, okay, I'm going to pass it to this guy so he can dunk the ball. But let's not convince or confuse that with something like Go or something like chess or even checkers, for God's sake.
All right, Jamarl, we're over time. You're right. Chess is a sport.
Thank you, Shane.
And you're the best one at it. It's hard, more hardcore than football, in fact. But no, I'm just being facetious. We got to go into a break. We're going to be coming back with Dr. Theopia Jackson. Having
effects on poverty, on childhood
effects on poverty.
development.
I was thinking about exactly how to summarize her, but as a psychologist, an esteemed psychologist on the West Coast, we'll be talking with her about a bunch of stuff having to do with the effects of child poverty on their psychology, their outlook on the life, how this stuff works. Fascinating conversation. We want to get into specifics with her too. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Dr. Jackson on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, the guy that doesn't believe chess is a sport, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I have personally been enamored and have been digging into this notion of poverty and how poverty affects, let's say, various communities, especially from the standpoint of violence and from the standpoint of child or people development. How do people become people? And, you know, this notion that the children are our future, okay, what lives are our children living to create the future that we are going to inhabit? And is it going to be a future that we want to inhabit? And if so, or if not, why? And that's kind of what I want to delve into and want to get into. Who are the kids that we're building in this country? And is there a way forward to do it differently? We're joined with Dr. Theopia Jackson. Dr. Theopia Jackson is the 2017 to 2019 president-elect for the Association of Black Psychologists and past president for the Bay Area chapter. She is co-chair for the Department of the Humanistic and Clinical Psychology and chair of the Clinical Psychology degree program at Saybrook University in Pasadena, California. Dr. Jackson has a long history of providing child, adolescent, and family therapy services, specializing in serving populations coping with chronic illness and complex trauma. Dr. Jackson, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me. Good morning to everyone, or afternoon, depending on where your listeners are.
It's early morning. Here's like 9:23 a.m. So definitely thank you, especially since you're on the West Coast. I want to get into this notion of childhood development. I was looking or going over some of the stats that have been taking place in Chicago with the number of killings and shootings and everything else. And we were getting into this idea of, okay, a 13-year-old is walking around with a weapon. Yes, the cop killed him. That's bad. Slap on the wrist. By the same token, that kid is walking around with a weapon. And I thought to myself, what is in the psychology of a kid to get to that point? What does it mean for a kid to get to that point, for that matter? Living in, let's say, impoverished circumstances, living in broken homes, or dealing with issues of trauma. What does it mean for a kid to develop that way? And that's kind of where I wanted this conversation to go. From your standpoint of your services, when you're dealing with kids, what is the typical, how can I say this? The kid that is dealing with, let's say, poverty. I mean, I grew up poor. What are the typical conditions that kid is growing up with and that kid is dealing with? What is the psychology of a child who's growing up basically poor in comparison to a kid that's not? And is there a difference?
Well, thank you for the conversation. First, let me clarify. I'm now on the East Coast. I've relocated. I'm in Maryland.
Oh, you're here. Okay, I'm sorry. You're here.
No worries, no worries. To your point, I have to step us back a moment. There are many theories about how one develops, how one becomes a person, becomes an adult. So I want to contextualize where my responses will come from. I have a more holistic approach. We're talking about mind, body, and spirit within context. So this developing child is not solely an individual. Right. Child's experience of who they're becoming is made up not only of their, quote, own genetic and in their own capacity and characteristics to be, but it's influenced by the environment in which they're developing. And that environment goes beyond simply the in the womb experience, if you will, in the family experience, in the community, in the school, and now in the global experience, because the internet world plays a crucial impact on the developing person. So this child that you're asking about, I would first say, what is the impact? What are the complexities that have birthed that child? Because there's no one direct answer.
I see.
A number of things that have contributed to it. It could have been, anywhere from unresolved trauma that the mother may have experienced while she was carrying the child in fetus, because we understand that just like we know that if a child hears beautiful music when they're born, when that baby is born, we know they recognize the voice of the mother, right? And we have a whole industry that has built itself around replicating the beautiful heartbeat of mom to that child. But if that mother was going through domestic violence or dealing with poverty herself or significant trauma and loss, then it has changed or altered and impacted some way her capacity in the healthiness of the baby that she's holding. And hear this not as pathology, people, not as if there's something wrong with her. Instead, hear it as the context, the complexities in which this child is being birthed, because I stand clear that no one brings a child into the world with the intentions of harming them. Instead, I have to ask myself, what goes awry that compromises or gets in the way of us giving the best to our children?
No, I do get that, and I accept that. And I don't think any mother, all things being equal, want to leave their kids in some kind of depravity or not. But this is the world to which we inhabit. And so let's use Chicago as an example. A kid grows up basically dodging what seems to be bullets. They call it Chirac. I mean, in this kind of comparison to a war zone, there were 71 people that were killed or shot, over the weekend, with, I think, several of those people being killed. And one component, there were, 4 mass shootings in like 8 hours. Something insane stuff that people have to live through. And that's not just Chicago. This situation replicates itself all throughout the United States, especially in impoverished areas. What is the psychology of a kid growing up in that?
Well, first and foremost, again, understandably so, there's a lack of trust, right? If we look at some early theorists who would say that when a child is born, their capacity to know that when they cry a certain way, that their needs will be met, that they learn how to negotiate with the environment around them. We hear the storiedness of parents being able to recognize if that cry means I'm hungry, or if I'm scared, or if my diaper is wet. Well, continue that throughout. If the environment is not able to respond adequately to the child's needs as they are growing up, then they're also getting a misdirection as to knowing how to actually get their needs met and how to recognize their own needs. Understandably so, they're being modeled certain things. This is a culture in which this child is growing up in, where they are learning certain ways of being because of what's happening around them. Many times, I've had clients that I've worked with who, bless their hearts, agree to leave their weapons at home when they come in to meet with me. But then when I get a fullness of what they're contending with, I begin to ask them, how is this therapeutic space helping them? And they say, at minimal, it's 1 hour a week where they can feel safe and whole as a real person and not have to worry about, do I need to protect myself? Am I going to get killed by the cop, killed by another? So they're learning this unfortunate system where they have to, quote, carry in order to protect, because the environment's not protecting. And let me also add here, to be very explicit, what's going on in these communities belongs to all of America. all of America. So those of us who are sitting in our comfort zones, raising our children in these safe, protected spaces, which I think is already a problem because each time trauma and tragedy hits these communities, the first thing we say is, I never thought it would happen here. That is the problem. We keep thinking that somebody's safe over there and let me throw away the West. Until all of America says we have a responsibility to make sure all of our communities are safe, all of our children are taken care of, not just the ones I birthed into the world or adopted or brought into my space, but everybody's child. Then what you just said about what they've inherited, it will change because they've inherited what we have collectively put in place for them to inherit. So it's a United States of America problem, not just an individual group or family or socioeconomic status.
Dr. Jackson, what you described in the language that you were using made perfect sense. And the idea that kids, growing up, your parents are there to respond to your needs, to perceive them, to respond to them. And then at a certain point, if that stops happening, well, it's going to stop happening to some degree. But you want there to be that reassurance, like a valid reassurance that they're there to help you and perceive what's going on. And I get what you're saying, that persists into the world. And ideally, if you have healthy communities, a healthy society, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to perceive, even if it's not their kid, even if they have no blood relation, they'll perceive that there's a problem. They'll try to figure out what it is and they'll try to solve it. That kind of thing. It seems to me a gulf though between that and growing up in a community where when you're trying to figure out what death is, you understand that it might happen to you and your friends at any moment. Where you hear first as a 5 or a 6-year-old about people dying in an abstract sense in your community. When you're a 7 and 8-year-old, you start hearing about people you know in a looser sense. And then at some point, it starts to hit your friends. That seems like that's not just needs not being met. That's like deep psychological terror that I simply can't imagine.
You are absolutely correct, but your narrative is not as on point as this. These 3, 4, and 5-year-olds are walking across where dead bodies lie, where they saw them being killed.
Yeah.
Witnessing people being killed.
Yeah.
This is why there was a Stanford study several years ago that was done with youth in San Francisco, in certain areas of San Francisco. It's a typical setting. It could be the same place in Chicago. What they found is the symptoms being endorsed around post-traumatic stress disorder among these children was greater than what our armed forces reporting when they were in deployed.
War zones, yeah.
So to the point, as I'm going back to as well, if it takes a village to raise a child, what happens when a village is hurting? So these are not, we have youth who are growing up and seeing, as I said, the killings happen. They're having to walk to school around where that death happened. To get into school many times, it's just as scary because of the danger zones walking through, where our playgrounds are taken over by people who are involved in gangs. It's not safe. Where our children are at the same time in schools to save costs. What's the first thing that's cut is extracurricular activities. Right. Now the schools are no longer safe. So what I'm trying to say, there's a macrame of issues because in these exact same communities, this is where you're going to have more liquor stores than grocery stores and banks. You're going to have poor quality vegetables and higher fast foods dollars, which is going to contribute to obesity, which again contributes to depression. So this is not a one-to-one equivalency. It is a macrame. It is the village complexities. And these are the same villages, the same communities where toxicity can happen in terms of how the trucks are moving through and what happens there, whereas in my neighborhood, we have legislation. They must go all around.
Right. Yeah, right. It's the difference between a poor community that is a throwaway versus not. Meaning the wealthier community has more say-so in regards to these things. Better schools, better services, better businesses, better all of that. I mean, you can look at the way that those things fall apart. No, I agree with you 1,000% on this, and I'm glad you're explaining it in this way. It's not the individual as if the individual in and of themselves are at fault. That person was born in a society, in a family, within a government, within all of that stuff, and all of that stuff etches itself on the person. And by the way, implicitly, meaning nobody has to tell the kid that, or nobody has to tell that child. That child grabs that stuff on their own from their environment and appropriates it and operates as such. and will be an adult based on that. One of the interesting things to this has to do with the way the different groups may appropriate this. So a child growing up in poverty that has family and everything else that might have been impoverished versus people in a society that don't have to live in that. Meaning this kind of differential in point of view, and on some level, a differential that can't necessarily, that is difficult to mind the gap. Whereas you know this, you've been talking to these kids, you've dealt with this from the standpoint of trauma and therapy and everything else. You have an expectation of, okay, this is what this looks like as they propagate through time. Well, the rest of the community doesn't necessarily have that, especially areas that are, let's say, better off and everything else. And they will take an impression or point of view on either the communities or the people in the communities without the underlying understanding of the problems and what those problems create in our world. Does that make sense? I'm trying to get to this notion of the gap between perceptions of somebody who's growing up in the community versus somebody who's outside of it, and how that stuff creates bad outcomes in policy and law and in engagement and interaction with one another.
Well, it contributes to systemic racism, actually, because of the negative message, because whenever we're, quote, talking about poverty, we're more likely to put up a brown or black face as if it is only happening in those communities. And I want to be very clear for the many European Americans I've worked with who are sitting in those same spaces, are experiencing some of the same traumas.
Yes.
We foster attention there. I also want to underscore the realization that even though these complexities are real, there are still vibrant, beautiful children, parents, and families who are living a very resilient life. And I want to be explicit here.
1,000%.
I am that child. That is my history. When every way in which we talk about an at-risk child, that was who I was. But yet I live a very different life. I want to be clear to say our children are not at risk. They are at potential in at-risk situations. And the realities are, what are we doing to change the situation so the child can breathe and be? I also want to say, too, I work enough that in the affluent areas, there's just as much pain and hell going on. It's just that the money covers the pain.
Right.
We're less likely to see it and look at it. We have children who are suffering in good homes behind closed doors, as well as walking the streets. We look at the gun violence that happens with the mass shootings and whatnot. So once again, to push back on the structural racism and falling into these, and when you talk about this gap, it's not a gap. It is a holistic problem impacting across all of the United States. It just manifests itself differently. The poverty and violence is a health epidemic in the United States. It is not an individual situation. And in the past, we've spent more time criminalizing the response or placing our law enforcement as the first responders, as opposed to approaching this as what it is, a health epidemic that has a responsibility for all professionals, as well as legislation to go on. Our elected officials play a role in this when they are coming in on a certain promise but yet not being held accountable to it. Our communities play a role in this when we sit and say, well, I don't want affordable housing over here because it's going to bring in the criminals, and yet you're right next door where a child's being beaten to death because the parents are drunk and no one's saying anything. So we keep pointing the fingers until we shift and say, how do we take care of all of America's children? There's a Maasai term, and the Maasai African tribe are those warriors. And when they greet each other, the first thing they say is, how are the children? If we ask ourselves, how are the children, and let that drive our answers, we would not be caging children around a political stance of whether or not we're going to have a wall. We would not have done much of what we've done to our own children. So they are a replication and an element of what's wrong in our society.
And I hear you. The attitude, the perspective, culturally, there are serious problems there. And you're also going over policy. That is much of what we cover on the show. I want to take a turn for a moment, though. You were a psychologist and a practicing one, and I believe, and that gives you a personal perspective and like knowledge, experiences, cases, people that you've worked with. I understand doctor-patient confidentiality. I'm not going to ask you to go over that necessarily. What I'm asking is, if there are people in the audience, and I'm guessing that there are, who are either in this situation themselves as kids or as young adults or just as adults in general, or parents who are worried about this, and you're talking to them, you're here right now, you've worked with people, how would you counsel them? I understand you need to get to know them. There are certain questions you'd have to ask. It's not just, okay, every advice is going to be applicable, but whether it's speaking to yourself in the past or speaking from the experience that you have working with patients, what would you say to them to try to make them feel more sane, more healthy, to give them a better chance of getting out in some crucial sense?
Right. And I'll also position that question as, how do I help them identify the right resources to do what they need to do? So the first message I would say is there's nothing wrong with you. It's what's happening to you, first and foremost. Secondly, that they love their children love them, but something is getting in the way of the feltness and the effectiveness of that love. And that's where they need to join together to figure out what it is and push back on that. May it be the poverty, may it be the unresolved depression, all the things we mentioned earlier. So, for example, I would also say, too, that when they're reaching out for good mental health support, that it must be the type of mental health support where my colleagues are not simply staying in the office having a 50-minute session alone with the child, but instead it must be mental health professionals who understand the communities in which they're serving, know how to connect the families to resources, mental health providers who play a role in advising leaders in the community who can make decisions to make changes going on, and also are able to meet the immediate needs of families. Sometimes I start working with certain families, I have to say, what do I need to do to first help them be in a space where they can benefit from therapy? And that could be, first and foremost, getting them connected for social support services in terms of just how do I keep food on the table, how do I get transportation back and forth to care, if you will. And I'll also say, too, that when they think about reaching out, it's how do you create a circle of care that moving through is not simply working with therapists or professionals. It is creating a circle of care. There are others in your community who are doing the right thing, who are trying to counter this. Connect with one another. Be a respite to one another. Have an intimate relationship where you can have sister-friend conversations, mother to mother. I can tell how hard it is for me, and we can hold each other up in this work. I want to give a shout-out for a lot of our beauticians and salons and barbershops. Beautiful healing conversations go on there where they kind of get to, release the tension and then hear each other and show each other up so you can kind of go back and be a better person. Realization that what's going on in their work setting. Many of our folks are sitting in oppressive work settings. They're trying to keep food on the table and a dollar coming in while they're being abused and misused in that setting. I would say then I'd invite them to look into what are your legal rights. Reach out to these attorneys who work in this setting who are doing beautiful pro bono work. What I'm trying to say here is just as the problem is very complex, the solution must be complex. It is, and a mental health provider should be ready to support families in connecting them with multiple resources so the families are empowered to take care of themselves and benefit from the resources around them.
Dr. Jackson, that is all very good advice. And yet, I imagine there are plenty of people whose ears should be open, but just aren't open to that kind of advice. They're angry. If their kid gets into crime problems, they find the kid with a gun or with drugs, and maybe they had problems with those things themselves, or they're just particularly cautious about them because they can see that those things can get bad. Their first response might not be to think about how much their kid loves them or they love their kid, and they need to understand them. Their first response might just be to get angry and to, be very afraid of the repercussions of this. And it would be natural. In other words, they're people, and I'm not just trying to play devil's advocate or nitpick or anything. How would you talk to them? How would you try to, because I hear you, but for somebody who doesn't hear you, I'm just curious to hear how you would navigate that.
I join with them in the anger and I've sat with that. I felt that. I've held that with them. Their anger is evidence of their love. If they did not care, they would not be angry. So my first response is, yes, I want my therapeutic space to be a safe space for a parent to kind of come in and let all that anger out. When I hear that anger, I do not hear it as abuse towards the child or badness or whatever. I hear it as love. I want them to let it out and hear so they can begin to breathe through it. Because we all know when you act out of anger, it only causes more pain. We have to honor the anger, let it go, move through and say, okay, so given what's going on, let me breathe and think, what are my options here? Because we also have the science that clearly says when we are in a heightened anger state, We're clearly not thinking.
Yeah.
Not able to make the best of it. This is where a good parent can find themselves shaking their baby and go, oh my goodness, what happened here?
That's just horrible.
And, you know, I think the sad part about it is that what you're describing is just life. Like, that's not even extreme life. This is what you described was basically my mom raising me. It's like dirt poor.
Absolutely.
She's in a situation where, at the point where I was sick, they were threatening to fire her because she was spending too much time at the hospital with a son with a chronic illness. It's stuff like that, where it's like you're working 8 hours a day, and yet you're not making ends meet. And the depression and everything else that's associated with it, because you can't mind the gap between those things.
The qualitative difference I might submit to you is access to resources. Access to resources. Because when that parent breathes and now says, what do I do? There's little to nothing at their fingertips to do.
Right.
That adds to the problem. Because when they go to law enforcement and says, and I've seen this happen, they go to, I want you to kind of help me just a little scare my child to kind of let this, they take it to a whole other level, and the child is now criminalized.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? So I don't understand.
But it seems like there's no way out. I mean, in the situation,
right?
It seems like there's no way out. My kid has an issue. How do I fix my kid?
We have to create, because again, those same parents are afraid to kind of come to some social support system to share how upset they are for fear their child will be taken away.
And because we have had conversations, sometimes that's what the parents, either they wanted or they were willing to go along with it. Because in some of these cases, the social workers are just bad. And I thankfully have been spared most of this, but I've heard about it. And Jamarl, you know what I'm talking about. We've had conversations about this recently. Kids being taken away from their parents, or just kids being taken away from their homes.
Or given to homes that are horrific. Put
in homes that are worse.
Yeah.
There are all these things that happen constantly. So my point is the social work program, this is not a perfect bastion. This has deep problems, and that itself drives a lot of people away from it. Isn't that right? What's your take on that, Dr. Jackson?
It drives away from, as we honor the problem, I must always lift up those who are doing phenomenal work. That's not all about. There are social workers who've done a phenomenal job. What I will say is, going back to my systemic issue, look at where we put our dollars.
Yeah.
Anyone who is working in direct service of children are the least paid and the least trained and the most overworked. That is a universal collective statement.
How do we fix this to go forward? I mean, we have to close, and I really do appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, great conversation.
Dr. Jackson, phenomenal. We have to bring you back to explore this further. Where do we go with this? How do we solve this? Because I agree with you, it's systemic. And, you know, part of the reason why I wanted to delve into this notion on poverty is because you have, half of the country making $42,000. I mean, I think before COVID, half of the country made $18,000 or less a year. And then so that means, okay, so you have like half of the country that is just basically poor. And you look at the various communities that the people are in, you look at the stress, the pressure, et cetera, and that's just basic daily life. And I agree with you. I mean, you have certain communities that might have money where they can use money to basically manage the issue with people who don't have cash or ends. Well, that issue is not managed entirely within the context of a household. How do we move forward on this? And from the standpoint of communities or families, or let's say communities, let's use this as the canary in the coal mine. How would those communities try to change? And I agree with you. It goes beyond just the family. But how do we make headway? If you had a magic wand.
Okay, I'll go with the magic wand. I love that. The magic wand is like I said, a shift in priorities, that everybody is held accountable based on how well we are doing with the caring of children. Every school should have the up-to-date textbooks and not looking at old ones. Every household should have certain conditions in place for them. I mean, it's where we put our dollars. People who are working in the industry that's providing direct service to children should be some of the highest paid, most trained, and well loved, so they can love others. We have to hold all of our as I said, our elected officials accountable. I'll give one quick example before we go, and then I want to close with a proverb. So my family has lived a very affluent life in how I grew up. And one of the things that my husband's industry did is whenever we, quote, donated to a school, they would match the funds. So if I'm living in a high SES school environment and public school is now costing me $3,000 or more because when we go to register, we're being invited to subsidize the cost of having additional teachers in there. So every time I write that check, his business matches that. Well, what that means is just going across the bridge into another city, we're broadening the scope between what public schools are getting, right? So an example we did here was his program, I'm trying to, because I don't want to say the name, his industry allowed the option for people to direct those matched funds into any school. So because all of the employees lived in a certain SES, it meant all those dollars went to that school district. Well, now we have the option to spread that out to lift up the other community, because at the end of the day, these children are going to show up together somewhere. If not in a movie theater, it's going to be in a college setting. So the more we keep spreading this divide, the more we're raising a problem within the next generation. And there is an African proverb that says that if a child does not feel the embraced by the village, it will burn it down in order to fill its warmth.
That's dark and true. I think the alienation that we're seeing in this country, I think it's that. I mean, whether it's the people raiding the Capitol, whether it's the protests over the course of the last year, I honestly do put it there. So, Dr. Jackson, thank you. I really appreciate this. The voice that you guys were listening to is Dr. Theopa Jackson. She is the 2017 and 2019 president-elect for the Association of Black Psychologists and past president for the Bay Area chapter. She is the co-chair for the Department of Humanistic and Clinical Psychology and chair of the Clinical Psychology degree program at Saybrook University in Pasadena, California. Dr. Jackson has a long history of providing child, adolescent, and family therapy services, specializing in serving populations with coping with trauma, illness, and complex trauma. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're now in the last segment of the show this week, the one where we take your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number, although I'll tell you right now, the lines are packed. We've got 4 callers. I'm going to get right into it, but if you call in, I hope we get to you. Let's try to be quick about this. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's on your mind?
Free Assange, Darren Azure. I have 2 quick comments. Oliver Stone movie on JFK assassination is doing well in Europe. He found 2 distributors, one in England and one in Ireland. He's looking for one in the United States.
This is an old movie, right?
This is 1991.
Yeah, this was an old film.
Right.
They re-released it?
No, the new one.
JFK Revisited.
The look at looking through Looking Glass. Yeah, so he's looking for distributors here. I think it's best for him to look at maybe Gab or maybe Gaia or somebody with their own platforms, with their own computer systems. My last comment is dealing with the extremely large telescope that's in optical telescope that's in Chile. It's going to be scheduled to get online 2024, 2025. When that come online, that's going to be the world's biggest telescope at almost 40 meters, 130 meters, 130 feet diameter. That's the one going to pick up the different different planets, because it's going to be so large. It's going to be taking in so much light. It's going to be the thing. It's going to
be phenomenal. Yeah. I mean, if you think of like Hubble and everything else, I mean, they tend to put these things on mountains, so they can have a clear shot of the sky. But yeah, Tarif, you're right. I mean, that thing is going to be amazing. I mean, you're talking about 20 million years ago, here's light from this planet. It's like
Which one are we talking about here? What's the name of this again?
It's called Extremely Large Telescope. It's in Chile. It's
that's the name?
3 meters in diameter. They just started to work on a foundation on it. It's over $1 billion. The mirrors itself is heavy as hell.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen them transport those? Like where they would put them on the truck and have there can't be any scratches. They're going like these,
the lenses.
Yeah.
No. I'm a weirdo, so I was watching a video, like an hour-long video on how to make telescope lenses. Yeah. Fascinating to watch.
Fascinating stuff.
And I lived in Los Angeles when the space shuttle, you remember the NASA space shuttle, it was being rolled through on like multiple 18-wheeler flatbeds or whatever throughout the cities. I remember seeing both of those things. I haven't personally seen this. I had heard about this, but it had fallen out of my mind. And for a second, I thought you were talking about the Arecibo telescope. The one that's in Puerto Rico, which featured in Contact, but that's fallen into complete disrepair.
Yeah.
That is dysfunctional, completely dysfunctional at this point. It just wasn't taken care of.
Yeah.
A sad thing. But again, Tarif talking about the extremely large telescope being built in Chile, in the Atacama Desert specifically. Tarif, thank you for the call. We got more on the line. Let's go to Nate calling in from Atlanta. Nate, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, I'm calling about, two things. One quick thing, I'm on the last episode of season 4 of Star Trek where Picard becomes a Borg. Really exciting stuff. Second thing, with regards to Chicago or just black people when it comes to violence and all that jazz, I believe, we're more of a people that has gone through multiple periods of reconstruction when it comes to slavery, the Black Renaissance in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then the destruction of those famous cities, Black Wall Street, and all that. And then with all of our leaders, MLK, Malcolm, the Black Panthers, all being assassinated or being in jail for long periods. Most of our Black leaders are gone. And now it's another kind of form of Black Renaissance where people are reawakening from that trauma that they've gone through, similar to like how empires fall in the past, where they come back from the embers of fire.
I hadn't heard it put that way. That sounds really beautiful, though, Nate.
Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Nick calling in from Atlanta. Thank you for that. We got Anthony calling in from Detroit on the line. Anthony, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, what's up, y'all? I don't know if you can hear me too good.
Yeah, we can. What's going on, man?
Okay, cool. Good morning. Yeah, I just I had a quick comment from the conversation with your dad actually the other day, Shane Lee.
Yeah.
Now, this is my frustration with the perspective that I believe you guys tend to take where and Jamarl, you pushed back to exemplify the point where Lee's Shane, your father, was kind of trying to somewhat erase the potential racist perspective of the Sixth.
Yeah, right. The number of people, like the white men that were there, it's like, hey, well, maybe they weren't racist. How do I know they're racist? How do we know they said they were racist? It was that stuff, right? Yeah.
It's because you have the position of trying to not play both sides or whatever, but trying to finding a middle ground, just find a new way forward or whatever, however you would like to frame it, which is I totally, but when it shifts into that, just apologia for what we can really say is at this point blatant, imperial, the structures, the ways to describe the superstructures of the world and the state apparatus that we live under and all of these things. And then it's actually more tangible when you consider that, okay, so you guys are independent actors, but RT and Sputnik News, as a part of one of those apparatuses in the world, has a perspective which might not be in line with yours, but it might be. And again, this is not speaking about you guys as individuals, but this is just about the benefits of that. Basically, kind of feeding. Essentially,
you're getting a little bit shaky here, Anthony, and we don't have. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be denigratory, but
we're trying to understand what you're saying. I don't know where you're going.
I don't. At the end, particularly, I don't get there. There's stuff that I want to say in response to this.
Feeding the troll. I'm saying the benefit of feeding the troll is not actually in your benefit, like to what you're trying to do. And I'm not saying RT and Sputnik are trying to just specifically feed the troll. Like they may just be doing what's profitable, yada yada, whatever. But I'm just saying, trying.
Oh, I see what you mean. There's a truthfulness to a particular situation, not just trying to be for opposition for the sake of opposition.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly how to respond to it, and we literally need to close. But I also feel I need to respond briefly. It's not just racism, it's accusations of white supremacy against the entire crowd, which seems like it's missing the point about what January 6th was. And I don't know how we would respond if those accusations weren't being levied, but they are. And I feel that makes the situation different, that it escalates it. Regardless, we got to close it out. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan back on Monday. Have a great weekend, folks. See you on the other side.